want to kick us off?
Hey, hello everybody. So welcome to the fifth and final event in the kind of international launch event for the Routledge Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness. So I'm here with my co-editor, Christy van der Westhuizen from Nelson Mandela. I'm from Leeds Beckett. Actually, that's probably the first time we've mentioned that, maybe. And we're here with a number of the co-authors for the panel on the Provocations section. And then later on, after a 5-minute kind of comfort break, we will also be doing some reflecting together on the discussions over the last few days, and then also the actual reflection section of the handbook that we'll talk about. Oh, lovely. I think I can see that is possibly William Cross joining us, maybe. So, okay. I'm just going to do some basic housekeeping, and then I'll be handing over to Christy to chair our first session. So, yes, welcome. This feels like it's been, well, it has been a marathon. I think for Christy and I, certainly. I don't know how many hours we've done all together of this, but have you added it up, Christy? Is it about 15, maybe?
It's been a lot.
It's been a lot, but it's been really, really great. I mean, the discussions have been fantastic. We've got some audience members. I haven't had a look yet, but some audience members have been with us for the whole 3 days, so they're probably as tired as Christy and I are. And many people have been bobbing in and out. So just lovely, really. I'm so looking forward to this final kind of set of discussions around provocations, and then the reflections with William E. Cross and Michelle Fine, so no less. And we're also hoping that any of the authors who are still around will kind of come on in. But I'm going to do the housekeeping and then hand over to Christy. So in terms of how we're running the sessions, please keep cameras and microphones off, except for when you're asking questions. Remember that thing about we are being recorded also, so anybody who doesn't want to be seen, if they want to be visible when they're asking questions, just remember that we're being recorded. Sorry, so that didn't make an awful lot of sense, but hopefully you get my meaning. So questions we will be taking in the chat, as well as live. I mean, generally people have been popping them in the chat. We're being streamed on Facebook and YouTube, and those questions also get transferred over to the Zoom. So please do pop your questions in, and Christy, when she's chairing her section, and myself, when I'm chairing the section that I'm chairing later on, we'll gather up any questions and we can see them, and so we can offer them out for discussion. And please do, because this is the last opportunity in this marathon. So finally, quite well, yes, hopefully, obviously, to all of us, there's kind of quite a complicated set of power dynamics that are in operation, that we're talking about and that relate to the discussions we're talking about. So we're just asking people really to be mindful of how those dynamics might be working in a space like this when we are engaging with one another, and when we're asking questions, and when we're in conversation. We've had, like I say, a set of really quite challenging but very kind of engaging and respectful discussions so far. Final thing is around the industrial action in the UK. I don't think I've ever spoken about industrial action quite so much either, but we wanted to be able to, well, I wanted to mention that because we have got a very significant industrial action going on at the moment in the English context, with 68 universities who are participating in that action. My own institution isn't one of those, but I am unionised and I do support the strike. So Christy and I did have some discussions about even whether we would continue to kind of hold the events, and we made the decision that we would, for all sorts of reasons, but in the main because these are events that involve all of us from all over. So, but I just wanted to highlight that action. And there are a number of our authors who haven't been participating because they are part of the action. yeah, it's about pay, conditions, pretty much everything you could think of, really. Unequal pay in particular, precarity, working hours, yeah, you name it. So please do find out about it if you're so inclined, you know, and I will leave it at that. Okay, over to you, Christi.
Great, thank you so much, Shona. Very good to be with you today. So this is the section in the handbook that's called Provocations. And basically the idea with this was to really go to those more difficult issues that have come up in the field of critical whiteness studies in the short existence of the field. The field started, well, sort of the start of the field is marked usually with Peggy McIntosh's article on the invisible knapsack. So we're talking late 80s, early 90s. Since this field has been growing, and I have to say it has actually been a burgeoning field since then, and not only in an academic sense, I would definitely also say in terms of popular discourses, popular engagement on the question of whiteness, making sense of whiteness. So I'm very glad that we've got a full house in terms of our section here today, with a number of authors, including Bernard Matolino, Amanpreet Ahluwalia, Samantha Vice, Phillip W, Colleen E, Boucher and Cheryl E, Matias. And these authors are literally across the globe, from Africa to Qatar, to Europe, to the United States. So very, very happy to have all of you in the house tonight. Sorry, it is tonight here in South Africa. I think the Americans are finding themselves in the morning, and so on. But very, very wonderful to have you here. So as a short introduction to this section, what we have is as I've mentioned, this is quite a new field. It's very much interdisciplinary. It has been a very lively intellectual space, I would say, and not only for theoretical contestation, but also for political contestation. For Shona and I, in any case, one can't make neat separations between these things. And for us, scholarship is also very much a political project, and it's inherently politicized, of course. So for us, it's important to grapple with that also in a quite an open and direct way. So some of the controversies that have come up in the field are around whether race should be abolished, whether race can be abolished as a frame through which we make sense of the world. We know that that race was introduced to the world, or how we introduced it to ourselves as human beings, actually through colonialism. So it is about 400 years old. But interesting work is now happening also in terms of tracing it, in a sense, further back to find what one could call forms of proto-racism. And then questions also around whether whiteness studies isn't just a ruse by white people to recenter themselves. Without more ado, let me quickly talk to the various chapters in this section. We have Bernard Matolino, and Bernard is an African philosopher, and he basically asks some hard questions of African philosophy in his chapter. And one of them ultimately is around what the shape would be of African philosophy without whiteness, if this is even thinkable. Then we have Amanpreet Olivaria, who takes the discussion to normative critical whiteness studies, because you will notice that the title of the handbook is Critical Studies in Whiteness. And in a sense, we're basically trying to open up new horizons. We're also not trying to be prescriptive to the field as it has developed so far. And an important aspect for us was to bring in the global South in this conversation, because it has been, the critical whiteness studies as such has been very much concentrated in the global North, particularly actually in Anglo contexts. And to bring in the global South, and to also specifically bring in scholars of color. So, and that's, so Amanpreet is also asking some hard questions, including whether critical whiteness studies can interrogate the ways in which anti-racist white subjects are implicated in the violences of whiteness. And then we have Samantha Vice, who has been writing very interesting reflections, actually, that have drawn quite a bit of attention here in South Africa over the past decade plus. And she's continuing her of some difficult questions, and particularly also around the what happens when a white subject, in pursuit of an ethics of integrity, in a sense, also bumps up against systemic and structural injustice. Then we have Phillip W. Gray, who writes on the alt-right. This is a theme that runs through the handbook, because we know, of course, that there are these resurgent white supremacisms across the world. And the alt-right, this chapter is very interesting because it actually looks at how the alt-right has mobilized the concept of intersectionality, not just the concept, but also the practice, the political practice, to which we most often, and of course, not just associate with Black feminist theory, but actually originates also with Black feminist thinkers in the United States. So that's a very interesting chapter. And then we end off with the chapter by Colleen E, Boucher and Cheryl E, Matias, who talk about exactly this question of this white supremacism that they see as a newly aggressive form of whiteness. And they refer to it as an emboldened whiteness that is akin to an evolutionary terror. So without further ado, let me immediately hand over to Bernard. Bernard, you have 10 minutes, and looking forward to hearing from you. What I'll do is I'll switch my camera off, and then when I switch on my camera, then you know you're just about to run out of time. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christi, and many thanks to Shona, firstly for inviting me to be part of this project, and many thanks for your patience with me. As I explained to you, Christi, when we were actually working on submitting our chapters and all, I was not in the best of spaces, but I'm glad that you're patient with me and I succeeded in completing whatever I had to complete. So talking about the chapter that I contributed, as Christi has indicated, I am an African philosopher. And one of the fascinating things about African philosophy, which I discovered as I started in this field, is how the African effectively was written out of the project of the modern human being. This project, which started, I think all of us will agree, during the Enlightenment period, a period which heavily relied on the usage of reason, on proofs, on display of critical thinking, etc., was also a period which remarkably was very discriminatory. It is a period that the Africans suffered the greatest sort of intellectual discrimination, and all sorts of unusual, if not uncharitable, words and claims were made or used against the African. In a very basic way, some of the leading philosophers, such as Immanuel Kant and David Hume, were very clear that the African was not capable of thinking. Hume would not even entertain the possibility that there was one African in Jamaica who was educated, and he makes it clear. He says, in Jamaica, they talk of one African as a man of learning, but I'm sure that he is admired for slender accomplishments, just like a parrot is admired for uttering a few words plainly. Kant quotes him approvingly, and he says, as Mr. Hume has demonstrated to us, There's not even a single African who can think. And elsewhere he writes, the man was quite black from head to toe, ample evidence that whatever he said was quite stupid. And this is also a period that we saw a very unusual form of business developing, chattel slavery. And the question that has always bothered many philosophers is, why did these great philosophers such as Hume and Kant, just to mention two of the most prominent, why did they commit themselves to such funny ideas? And the explanations that have been offered are that, one, for Kant, he was firstly mostly interested in anthropology, and his interest in anthropology, which was not strictly different from philosophy, then led him to those misadventures. And Hume's commitment to some type of knowledge system also misled him into believing that race was a category that mattered. But other people want to dismiss these thoughts as trivial and say, well, they at least did not constitute a major part of this philosopher's thinking. They were men of their time, and we should excuse them on those grounds. But that's not going to work. Why? Because there were people also of Hume and Kant's time who challenged Hume and Kant and tried to make them see the waywardness of their views about the African's capability when it comes to reason. So philosophy, as we know it today, as a modern project, is something that has been extremely hostile to Africans in its conceptualization and in how it has been executed, particularly in the, say, 20th century. It really did not have any room or consideration for African thinking or African systems. Africans then had to force themselves on the scene of philosophy, particularly talking about modern African philosophy, starting in the 1960s, going into the 1970s. That's if we ignore the first Belgian priest who wrote something about African philosophy. So for indigenous people from Africa, their first attempt at philosophy, starting in the late 60s, 70s to the 80s, has been something quite strange. And that strange characteristic runs up to this day. African philosophy is largely characterized by this need to prove itself. One, to prove that it exists, and two, to prove that its methodologies are philosophical, and three, to prove that it's a viable way of doing philosophy. Now you may ask yourself the question, why does this need occupy African philosophy so much? And the answer is simple. It goes back to what I started with when I started talking about this chapter that I contributed. It goes back to how the modern African was written out of the genesis of modern reason. The modern African was not part of the Enlightenment. Modern African is not part of modernity even. Modernity is imposed on the African through colonialism, and it's a half-hearted attempt at modernizing the savage. It's of course an exploitative mission, but it's also a half-hearted attempt at bringing the savage on board with what the modern agenda and what the modern program is about. And very basic to this project is the idea of reason, the nature of reason. And the African sort of fails to live up to that idea of reason, whatever that idea is, as propounded by scientists and philosophers of the Enlightenment. So that's what captures African philosophy. But there's got to be a realization, and that's what I try to fight with in the chapter. And I think there's got to be a realization from African philosophy that it's been forced into a conversation, or it's been forced into a sort of a response that it should not engage in. Why do I say so? Africa basically is reacting to white paradigms, and we know that whiteness in this case represents a racial category. And as it represents a racial category, it's a racial category of superiority. And though whiteness comes in a variety of shades, and the very idea of whiteness itself may change from time to time or from place to place, depending on a number of factors. When we think of whiteness in Africa, we always tend to think of it in terms of people who have got power, who can exercise power over Africans. Historically, we can see it through slavery and colonialism, and we can see how the white world is developed probably sometimes at the expense of the African world. Hence now, what we are forced to deal with is a reaction to the existence of whiteness, which I equate to racism, because whiteness is not necessarily a metaphysical or a true biological state or standing. It is an attitude that's sponsored and that's informed by a variety of factors that have got actually nothing to do with what human beings really are. And these factors lie in the social, political, and economic sphere. So those who are in South Africa know of these funny incidents that we got under apartheid, where one individual could be first classified as white, later on they are removed from the white category, they are put under what we call colored here, which is mixed race, or some were promoted from mixed race status to whiteness. So whiteness is not real in that sense. It's an unreal thing, but it's just as powerful as racism. It's got to do with attitude, exercise of power, and positionality at any given time. Now, what African philosophy has been caught up in is reacting to this whiteness, let's call it that, which is accompanied by racism. And how is the reaction unfolding? The reaction is unfolding with this need to justify why African philosophy exists and why it should be seen as existing. Precisely because philosophy in the Western world is seen as the badge of civilization. If you do not have philosophy, you are uncivilized. Hence, people like Hume and Kant also took trouble to categorize white people in different systems, depending on what they thought their philosophical abilities were, or their ability to behave in ways that were not so offensive, or ways that were far removed from the status of being a savage. Everybody else who was non-white was, to varying degrees, less than white. If we're going to philosophize seriously on the continent, we've got to think about, how many minutes do I have? One?
We've got actually less than one, but I think you just need to bring us into your main point on Africa.
If we have to think seriously about whiteness, it is nothing but a continuation of the capture of the Black person. And in this instance, what I try to prove is that it's the capture of the ability of the Black person to set up their own independent thought systems, serious philosophical questions, and things that they need to think about independent of whiteness. And if we're able to move from that, we may just as well develop a relevant philosophical system. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. I know it can be painful, this kind of limit on time, but what I'm looking forward to is in our Q&A session, because I think we'll definitely have more time to tease out, because what I found particularly also fascinating about your chapter, apart from what you've said so far, of course, is this whole notion of the suspension of whiteness. So if because that is something that I think is something that one has been grappling with in relation to the racial order. So our next speaker is Amanpreet Ahluwalia. Aman, let me hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Christi. If you all just give me a second. So, hi to everyone that's joined us. It's such a pleasure to be sharing this space with you all. Thank you to Shona and Christi for doing such an amazing job of bringing many of us together across all sorts of expanses, both in the book and in the events over the last few days. And also thank you for inviting me to be part of the book and for helping me to create some time, I guess, to grapple with some of the things that I talk about in the chapter. So I'm just going to start by saying a little bit about myself and my relationship to theory, and then maybe pick up a few key themes that I speak to in my chapter. So I would say that my chapter is an exploration of what happens when normative social science masquerades as critical, and what it does in the world, I think, for people like me, I guess, who aren't academics, or people even who are academics and start on an academic journey. But yeah, I'll maybe speak about that a little bit later. So I'm not an academic. I guess that feels significant to say in this space, because this isn't, I guess, you know, taking complex themes and finding, I don't know, uncomplicated ways to say them is not my strong suit. I think in patterns, I think in relationalities, and in complicatednesses, and speaking to these in a way that is linear, I guess, isn't really my strong suit, but I'm going to do my best. I guess it feels important to say this because I feel like a bit of a space invader in this space, and probably also am a little bit. And I feel like my being here today probably speaks to what the book is trying to do. You know, me not having an institutional affiliation, but kind of being here, speaking, I think, speaks to the commitment to centering like the work in its widest meaning, and all the people, I guess, that matter within that. So I guess that's like another way of saying what I think is significant about the collection, but also about the way that Christi and Shona work. And that felt important to say. So contextualizing my relationship to theory. So all my life, I'd grown up with a desperately sort of intense feeling that things don't make sense. So the way that I was taught to categorize the world, or the way that the world was, or the categories that we work to normatively, you know, I felt from a very young age that I didn't neatly fit into any of those categories. And I think that that was a really, I think that was probably quite a meaningful experience in some ways for me, because it made me search out meaning, but also was very difficult. And so I came to theory. So I'm just going to give you a quote from Bell Hooks. It was one of the first things that I read, actually, when I was just embarking on my journey of trying to figure out the world. So I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. And I saw in theory a location for healing. And I think that actually what my chapter is about, it kind of speaks to that journey a little bit for me. And now I guess as a social justice practitioner, my investment in academia and in critical disciplines is really in that application. Social change is messy. And so theory is the place I come to help me unpick or understand some of the kind of relational messes that I sometimes find myself in when I'm laboring towards change. And I think, I'll come back to that. Okay. Ignore that. Ignore that I said that. So in terms of my orientation to what theory is for, I started my career as a youth worker and in leadership development with young people. And my focus in that work, I guess I wouldn't have described it like that at the time, but now I think this is how I see it, was how we internalize the limits of what we believe possible from how we're socialized in the world around us. And so for me in this chapter, and in my work actually, is really, so it's about thinking, how do we imbibe, I guess, the social relations of power, and what does that limit in us? And I think that for me, if we're thinking decolonial possibilities into existence, we really need to like interrogate our relationship to how we create the conditions for social change to happen, for us to even think those into possibility. So for me, my work is about understanding the process. So my provocation, I think, in this chapter is really to not only think about what kind of, okay, so let me start again. So for any volume that was going to talk about critical whiteness studies, I think it was really important for it not just to talk about what whiteness is, but really what the social relations of whiteness does. And for me, as a social change practitioner, you know, I'm really interested in what that enables or constrains, and how the way we internalize things limits what we believe possible for ourselves and the world around us. So really how our hurts and the ways that we're broken by racialization, whiteness, you know, to really understand that, and also think about how we chart a journey to a different place from that. So one of the key themes that I kind of talk about is complicatedness as an analytic. I'm just looking at the time I've got. Okay. So I think that for me, the way that we live racialization is complicated, and developing a complex analysis and an analytic to make sense of how we live and what our relationships look like, and you know, the kind of ways that we live racialization has really, really strong real world applications and effects. So, you know, in this chapter, I talk a little bit about how I came to normative critical whiteness studies and felt really alienated by the simplicity of it, because, you know, what I was there, I guess, trying to do in those pages was make sense of the anti-racist work that I had been doing, and, you know, my relationships with my white colleagues, and the racism that existed between us, I guess. And, you know, that there was so much about how I live my life that I wanted to try and understand through that work. And I guess the laziness of it, maybe that's not a kind way to express it, but for me, the lack of complicatedness did something. And so I guess there's something about having a responsibility. I think it was about bringing it, like for me, bringing a focus into what an ethical way, I guess, to think about scholarship might look like. I don't actually explore that, but I think I do talk about the effects of that. So that's up to people, you know, to take where they want to. So in the chapter, I try and use some autobiographical examples to talk about the effects of coloniality, what it creates in our everyday, the presences and the absences, and how, you know, in the process of social change, what we grapple with, you know, so if we're thinking anti-racist or decolonial realities into possibilities, into a reality, like what, I guess I struggle to find work that speaks maybe to some of the realities that I live every day in my work. So I wanted to do that in this chapter, and I think the chapter does some of that. You know, some of it talks about my relationship with my colleagues, some of it also talks about my relationship with my white husband, and, you know, what that speaks to, I guess, or what living those complicatednesses can teach us about the world, really. I think, you know, one of the other things that I feel really passionately and strongly about is taking a trauma-informed approach to thinking about social change that centers bodily feeling. And so I also chart some of how I do that work, or what that work looks like for me in the chapter. And then kind of explore a little bit what healing, what theory that heals can do for us, I guess, by talking about it from the context of what it did for me. And in terms of my hope for the work, I know that I'm probably just
you're just leading across overtime, yeah.
Yeah, I've just got one last thing to say. So I guess my hope for the work is to call contributors to develop analyses and analytic methods complex enough to hold all of the complicated ways in which we live racialized power, and for us all to kind of that we can use to do the work of healing the fractures between those parts of us that have been taught are incompatible with whiteness, so our othernesses, and how we bring those things together to come to a more complex understanding of how we live racialization. That's me. Thank you so much, Aman. I think lots to work with there. I'm looking forward to our questions. I see we've already got a question for Prof. Matolino, and please do post more questions and comments. You're very welcome to do so. Samantha, over to you. I think I'm going to keep my camera on actually, and I'll gesture wildly when you're approaching the end.
Well, like everyone, I'd like to thank Shona and Christi tremendously for the opportunity to contribute to this marvelous project, and also to express my enormous admiration for the professionalism of the book process itself and of this launch. And the thought of juggling so many time zones just makes me feel jet lagged, and I don't know how you did it. So yesterday in his presentation, Rolando Scott asked, I think this was in a discussion, how do we have a livable life? And that phrase stayed with me. And I was rereading some of the papers in the book in preparation for this, and the speaker who we've just heard from, Amanpreet, explores in her chapter something she calls creating livability within all of this psychically. She says this is not simple work. And I think those two thoughts from my co-authors exactly capture what has interested me for many years. And I think Amanpreet's chapter is perhaps a nice counterpoint to my own in her acceptedness of what she's now called complicatedness. That resonated very much with me. As I was preparing for this evening, I also had in mind Aman's exploration through art and also Bernard's paper in different ways. So they're very much in the background of my thoughts, as in is the continuous worry about centering white experiences all over again. And I'm happy to talk more about that. So my question in picking up on Rwanda's is, how do we have a livable life in a racially unjust society as a white person whose identity is part of the problem, as a person who is importantly white, but not only that, and who wants her life and herself to be defined not only as white, in full recognition that it is properly also so defined. More particularly, perhaps, my interest is in a general tension that I see between some ideals of character and taking morally seriously what is a problematic identity. So most broadly, how can one sincerely acknowledge and work on the meanings of one's identity while retaining self-respect and integrity? And these are ideals that are intuitively attractive and arguably indispensable for being a good person and for leading a worthwhile life. Now, I think that this tension can arise with respect to different identities, but in this chapter, I focus on the racialized white identity in a structurally racially unjust society. And I argue that white racial privilege puts a white person into a position that both requires and puts in jeopardy integrity and self-respect. We are morally in the wrong, partly because of social features over which we have little unmediated control, yet we must take some kind of responsibility for our racial position while trying to lead a decent life. How is it possible to retain self-respect and integrity in this situation? What do these difficulties suggest about the availability of some virtues of character in an unjust world? We seem to be left in the position of being called upon ethically to take up a task that will undermine the possibility of being ethical in other ways and in living well. Being called upon to take up a moral and personal task that will undermine values is troubling and worth thinking about. And as I said, I think it's generalizable beyond racial identities, though particularly live and pertinent here. So what exactly is this tension around white identity that I'm interested in, and what is the context in which it becomes salient? So I have in mind attempts by morally conscientious white people living in structurally racially unjust societies to take seriously the meaning of their whiteness, to take it on, if you like, as a moral project. And I'm interested in people who are not behaving in immediate and obviously racist ways. And I mean this in a purely popular sense. They're not harming Black people in particular. They're not being hateful or disrespectful in any obvious ways. But nonetheless, they're embedded in unjust racial structures that they benefit from. And in this kind of situation, to put it very crudely, it can be difficult to know how to think about yourself. Taking one's privilege to heart, as I put it, means taking responsibility for that privilege, appreciating its myriad meanings and effects on others, recognizing that to many people who are not white, our whiteness can be the most important, most defining feature of us. We have to see ourselves as others see us publicly. I think that is part of any program of trying to move towards a more racially just society. So this moral task requires accepting our identity as white, where that is acknowledged as deeply problematic. And it can seem that we identify ourselves as most defined by our whiteness in this context as well, at least when we're thinking about our relations with others in this problematically shared world of ours. And so my worry then is the pressure that this process of taking to heart, which I think is ethically required, the pressure that puts on white people's sense of self. Having the right kind of relation to oneself is central to most, perhaps all philosophical, religious, and psychological accounts of human nature and a good human life. We certainly have to stand in the right relations to others, but that doesn't seem sufficient for a flourishing life. If we hold ourselves to no standards, if we stand firm on nothing, if we hold ourselves in contempt, if we treat ourselves in ways we wouldn't treat others, if we cannot make claims for ourselves as moral equals among others, in all of these ways, we fail to maintain the conditions of a bearable and livable life, and we fail to aspire to ideas of character that seem fundamental to a good life for independent reasons. And that constellation of ideas, standing firm, not holding yourself in contempt, having standards by which you judge yourself, I think of those in terms of the self-directed virtues of self-respect and integrity. I give an account of different forms of self-respect. I unpack integrity in the paper, but I don't think it's necessary to go into that now. In the context that we find ourselves, I argue, integrity and self-respect pull us in different and potentially mutually undermining directions. They require taking to heart our whiteness, but are undermined by that process, as it requires admitting the damaging reality and meanings of that identity. We risk, and this is often what we've done to other people, put them in this risk, we risk collapsing ourselves to our racial identities and becoming exhausted by that identity. Self-respect and integrity also require that we pay attention to those personal areas of life where so much meaning is constructed. Our relationships, our meaningful pursuits, being good parents, being good friends. And sometimes this can pull us away from the project of dealing with whiteness and of our understanding ourselves in terms of our whiteness. But in that process of paying attention to meaningful lives in other ways, we are then perhaps not paying attention to whiteness as we should. And so integrity and self-respect can then be undermined from that direction. The deeper problem then is how to take whiteness to heart while retaining a positive enough self-conception to enable such work at all. How do we continue to think ourselves worthy of undertaking a moral project when that moral project tends to undermine self-worth? If we value integrity and self-respect and consider them to be constituents of admirable character, we are left with a problem. When we are privileged in conditions of structural injustice, integrity and self-respect seem to require that we take to heart our morally dubious situation. However, we are in certain respects morally damaged by just that progress. Now, I come to no solution in my chapter. I don't think there is a solution. There probably are not any clear-cut solutions for existential situations of this kind. And I, of course, understand that similar kinds of entanglements of complicatedness apply in much more charged ways to non-white people. But given the project of understanding whiteness, of trying to take responsibility for that whiteness at a personal level, the lived experience of whiteness, it seems something that we have to grapple with. And it seems to me particularly interesting that a moral process can undermine moral virtues themselves. So I think I'll leave you with that and we can pick it up in discussion. Thanks very much, Christi.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. We still actually had a minute left, but we'll add it to the pool. Yeah, thank you, Samantha. And I see some more questions are landing in our chat. Please don't be shy. Then I'm going to now hand over to Phillip W. Gray, who will be addressing us on the phenomenon of the alt-right and intersectionality. Thanks, Phillip.
Thank you very much. And also, as with the others, thank you, Christi and Shona, for the opportunity to contribute to this. When they sent the invitation, I did message back saying that the tone of mine would probably be of a rather dissonant nature from the rest of the volume. They said, please just send it along anyway, so I greatly do appreciate that. In particular, admittedly, some of my views on this would be somewhat different. Well, I'm certainly no alt-rightist. I am rather much a rightist in terms of my politics, which probably makes me a bit singular in this volume. So it is appreciated to have this sort of view. So the alt-right itself and intersectionality are in many ways sort of pre-intersectional nature. My own area of research is totalitarianism and political extremism. This is how I arrived to this particular topic. And one of the concerns that came to my mind looking at especially many, or at least various parts of critical whiteness studies, is it seemed to fundamentally oftentimes misunderstand or not really even see what, if you'll forgive the bluntness of language, what the enemy actually believed. Instead, there was sort of a construction of what it would be convenient for the enemy to be for us. So within the chapter, I kind of mentioned D'Angelo and people of this type, that oftentimes there's almost a sort of discount psychoanalysis that's going on, that either those who are involved with whiteness are, or kind of, accentuate this element. Either there are people who are afraid of losing their power, they want to keep holding on to it, or people who are in some ways just misunderstanding rather obvious things, that in effect, the other in this case, so the alt-right being sort of the example of this, are effectively either cis-nerdly forms of cartoon villains or are morons. Which is convenient for us. Is a convenient enemy to have, rather than a real enemy and what they really believe and what they think, whatever that's right or wrong, that it's always prudent to know what your enemy actually thinks. So the alt-right itself. Now, admittedly, as I'm using the term inside this chapter, it's a constructed term. The alt-right itself as a movement, if we're going to use it that broadly, it came into existence around 2014, 2015, and effectively it collapsed by 2017. Now the term basically just being more of a term of abuse. For this construction of it I'm using, which includes many individuals who have labeled themselves dissident right, the new right in France, others of this type, probably wouldn't necessarily prefer it this way, but there's a common trait that these have. Key common trait for the alt-right in this sense would be that they have a particular concern and focus on white identity, white populations, and or white racial consciousness, versus say other forms of rightism that may be focused more on nationalism, just purely, maybe more focused on elements of the economy or issues of that type. One of the things that was striking in looking at, say, some of the more major thinkers inside this constructed alt-right, people like Greg Johnson or de Bensois, always mispronounce French names, my apologies, Jared Taylor, people of this type. Or even looking at the various anonymous sort of people, so names like Orwell and Good, or guy who goes by Bronze Age pervert, or things of this type, names of people who are influential, though they write anonymously, is especially how so much of it seemed to overlap with certain types of themes that one would see, especially in some of the sort of precursors to intersectionality, and in particular to Collins and her Black feminist thought. Before getting to that specific element of it, part of this seems to be a genealogical matter. That if we're looking at the sort of sources earlier on, that many of these sort of two broad movements, let's say the alt-right and the intersectional left, for lack of a better term, are kind of pulling from a little bit earlier on, would be something like pulling from people like the anti-foundationalism of Nietzsche, but pulling from different elements of it. So for instance, from more of the left, pulling from his agonistic anti-foundationalism, for the alt-right, tending to pull more from his anti-egalitarianism along with his anti-foundationalism. Additionally, oftentimes looking through elements of what's usually referred to as a German conservative revolution in the 1920s and 30s. Some of these authors are of complete irrelevance to intersectionality, people like Oswald Spengler or Ernest Junger. But again, the sort of similarities in others they're pulling from, particularly Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt. So from Heidegger, pulling the elements of the concerns about technology, pulling in the same sort of anti-logocentrism, pulling in some of the more importance of myth, and Carl Schmitt pulling in the the friend-enemy distinction as the central element of politics, as well as the role of the exception in terms of how these things work. Again, how, say, for intersectional or pre-intersectional groups versus the alt-right, what they're doing with these obviously are rather different. But in some ways, they're kind of going along similar grooves because of the similarities in some of their inspiration, or at least some of the individuals who they're finding useful ideas or modalities from. So getting back to someone like Collins. So writing in sort of a pre-intersectional phase, talking about the issue of framing, and especially of sort of the Black woman in America. So much of this being sort of American focused, as kind of almost sort of the earlier instance of marginalization. Then in terms of someone who's been completely otherized in terms of the framing popular culture-wise and so forth, the Black woman is the sort of the main, sort of the primary example, almost sort of, I don't want to say the pure exemplar, but in effect, sort of the main one. And then this moving on, say, as intersectionality starts to develop, but where there's sort of more of a comparison in the sense of saying what might be similar locations in this sense to this example. For the alt-right, they're effectively making a similar kind of argument. Now, some of them are familiar with people like Collins and so forth. They're probably not directly bringing in from her, but instead are following similar sort of elements, coming also from Gramsci, which we may get back to if we have a chance. But in their view, in terms of the hegemonic type of culture, and particularly inside a neoliberal system, they say that this kind of negativity, this sort of othered being, is the white man in places like America and Western Europe. And that this is kind of the example now of true marginalization, of who's been kind of pushed to the side. Now, again, this is sort of intersectional. My own hypothesis would be that if things kind of continue on as they are in terms of dynamics, within about 10 to 15 years, we might see something like a rightist version of intersectionality, with this idea of the white male as the sort of example, then connecting on to other types of social locations. So say working class, certain types of European indigenous groups or others that might end up getting sort of labeled in or put together with this. Now, one other element with this is when they talk about whiteness, so we're going to talk about what they're against, what they're resisting, and then what they're for, in a sense. In their view, one of the biggest difficulties in terms of the neoliberal hegemonic culture is that white effectively has been viewed as either a null set, that it's nothing, it's bland. There is no white culture, there's no white cuisine, there's just nothing really there. And the other, that white is evil, that white is equated with genocide, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, that it could effectively be combined over with almost anything else, that white is effectively a synonym for evil, that whiteness is a synonym for the devil, for lack of a better term. So kind of like with the word queer among LGBT populations earlier on, of taking back that sort of name, various in the alt-right are saying we're taking back white to try and make it into something more positive. Now, having said that, what is the positive? One thing that's important to note with, and this is something pretty general with much of the alt-right as it's understood, European and American, is that in contrast to earlier forms of white identitarian racialism, it tends to be primarily separatist rather than supremacist in nature. And then kind of getting to, again, this knowing your enemy, this to me strikes me as one of the major problems that arises. We talk much about white supremacy, and sometimes it's more in technical language, but in terms of ordinary language, they are not generally supremacist. They don't want to dominate other populations. They want them to go away, or for them to go, or for white populations to isolate away from them. They're interested in ethno-nationalism and ethno-states, usually giving something like Japan as a key example of what the benefit of an ethno-state would be. Certainly, they have a very high opinion of whites. This would generally be in terms of a preference for one's own. The idea is that it is a natural and genetically, evolutionarily necessary element for a group or kinship group to have an elevated view of itself. And effectively, their argument is that every race or ethnicity has this, whites should do the same, is effectively their argument. The one key thing that would be, the one final thing with this that would be useful to note is that when they say things about in terms of race and culture, one key concept is the notion of bioculturalism. In effect, the idea is that culture develops from genetic traits, group genetic traits, and that these cultures and regimes that form can then also have eugenic or just eugenic influences on these populations as well. And therefore, there is no such thing as a universally good or bad law. It is dependent upon the biocultural makeup of the population, and thus multi-ethnic and multiracial populations by necessity will always be in conflict. Yes, probably should finish up there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Philip. I'm sure we've got a lot to talk about there. And let me immediately hand over to our last two speakers who I've co-written a chapter. It's Colleen E, Boucher and Cheryl E, Matias. Please start. You've got your 10 minutes. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I am here with Cheryl Matias. She's at the University of Kentucky, and I am at the University of Colorado, Denver as a PhD student still working on it. And we both work in whiteness studies pretty much exclusively. And our chapter is an evolutionary terror, a critical examination of emboldened whiteness and race evasion. And so we really start with the assertion that race is permanent, a la Derek Bell, but that whiteness is going to evolve. It continues to evolve. It's evolving here today. Whiteness will find a way to stay supreme. And so our framing theory, of course, is critical whiteness studies, but in the chapter and in several other pieces, I think Cheryl already linked them earlier, but we'll do it again. A couple other pieces recently published, really focusing on how a critical study of whiteness needs to replace or at least come in addition to critical whiteness studies. And this is because the critical whiteness studies on its own tends to center whiteness again. And some of you have talked about that reification already today, that whiteness recenters itself through things like talking about privilege, talking about fragility, which focuses on white feelings, their emotionalities, the ways that white folks may worry that they're being perceived as racist, for example, and wanting to prove that they're not. These are these are things that critical whiteness studies can sometimes focus on. Whereas under the idea of a critical study of whiteness, the focus can be recentered on the ways that people of color are actually being discriminated against and suffering from the very things that white people are benefiting from. This chapter was written during the summer of 2020 in the United States when, as you may all know, the American people were going through a whole lot of Black Lives Matter rallies and protests that were colored in the media, sometimes as riots and violent. And in the meantime, this brought up a whole bunch of book groups, white people saying, I want to read about my privilege. I want to learn about, how I might be fragile, and then getting fragile about the protests as they happen in the cities across the United States. So as we wrote this chapter, thinking about a critical study of whiteness being used to analyze these events and say that, whiteness can be recentered very quickly and very easily if we aren't careful. So some of this chapter has some of those examples from, a current time in United States history back in, way back in 2020, but they're just examples of things that, have happened historically and continue to happen. So one thing that I want to bring up before I think Cheryl can speak to the need for critical studies of whiteness really well, and I think has a diagram ready to show too. In the chapter title, I mentioned race evasion, which is meant to be a complete replacement for the term colorblind racism. And I'm really passionate about this idea. Sabina Nama wrote an article in 2017 about using discrit to discuss why colorblindness is a co-opted term from disabilities, but it also really takes the onus of racism off of the white person, saying it's an affliction, that they are colorblind, that it's not something that they're choosing to do. A lot of contributors in this book talked about the ignorance of whiteness. Charles Mills, of course, is the beginning of our chapter because he should be. He's obviously writing about white ignorance, but in a way that says that it's a choice, that white people are often choosing to have this, indeed, choosing to be ignorant, or I believe Christi said it on the first day, an unremembering. She was quoting somebody, but the unremembering of what whiteness really means. And when we say that somebody is colorblind to racism, then in white society, that's actually like the epitome of not being a racist, is to say, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. But if you say that you are race evasive, you're admitting that you are choosing to ignore a racial reality that exists in our world. And so I prefer, and I think that many scholars are starting to do this, use race evasion instead. And it really plays well into what a critical study of whiteness will do, is call it what it is, call it race evasion instead of an affliction that you might have, that or a choice to just not see color. So on that note, I'm gonna hand it over to Cheryl, who will be able to talk about the need for this critical study of whiteness and Black whiteness studies, which are in those articles that I think she posted. Note also that Cheryl wrote, she's on her Zoom here, that she's Mother Scholar. I too am Mother Scholaring right now, and if a baby appears, that may happen. Over to Cheryl.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for hanging in this this long discussion. I'm so honored to be in a space where it's this global talk, and we don't often, we have Zoom now. Why can't we just do this all the time, right? Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I'm hearing is, and I'm concerned about in our field, is that everyone becomes a whiteness scholar, despite actually engaging in the literature. And what we've seen in the United States is really a directed kind of movement to not cite scholars of color who are doing this work, or to focus on critical whiteness studies as a way to just focus on white people's like racial epiphanies, right? And I think that's and I have a special issues coming out later on the International Journal of Qualitative Studies. that is going to talk a little about Black, Indigenous, people of color, and how we approach a critical study of whiteness. And when we're talking towards a Black whiteness studies, we're talking about going back to some of the roots. I know it was kind of mentioned earlier that we're trying to bring more scholars of color into this field, yet scholars of color have been doing this kind of work since Du Bois, and he's talking about the veil. You know, when James Baldwin was, giving a lecture in 1963 to teachers, talking about their whiteness and how it impacts Black children. When we talk about Toni Morrison and talking about the literary whiteness and how it's manifesting in all of within all of literature. So I think what we're talking about in terms of towards a Black whiteness studies is to honor, not just pay mention, not just say, Du Bois been doing it, or, Baldwin or Fanon has talked about it, but to really engage in the scholarship that scholars of color have been doing with respect to how whiteness is framed, and also to move away from the focus on white racial epiphanies, because that in and of itself, as I've written in my first book, it becomes narcissistic. It becomes this whole, well, how can I better myself? How can I pontificate that I'm an anti-racist to assuage the guilt, the immorality, or the feelings I have for the shame, or what Thandeka writes in Learning to be White, some white ethnic shame that I have, so I can just wear like a safety pin and feel like I'm a good moral being. So moving away from that, we're really thinking about how whiteness studies cannot be for the sake of white racial epiphanies in and of itself, but that it should be always forever connected to the harm and trauma and experiences that Black, Brown, Indigenous people feel when whiteness is expressed. So that connectivity is always there and never lost. So in the work that we do, and then the publications that we shared, is that we're moving away from a critical whiteness studies that, is very strategic in not citing folks of color, because then it makes this rendition that scholars of color have not been in this field for a long time. So that to also think about the interconnectivity, I think it's the interpolation that Sarah Ahmed always talked about, right? It's the interpolation between how one person is reacting, or Gerald Yancey does this beautifully in his chapter on the elevator effect, right? He's talking so beautifully how one's idea of Blackness becomes interconnected. It can be independent, but then it becomes in whiteness intertangled, right? It always becomes the antithesis of what whiteness is not. And so that interpolation between the white woman's reaction to his Black body in that elevator becomes the point of the phenomenological point of interrogation. So when we're thinking about towards a Black whiteness studies, I think the field really needs to look at how whiteness studies also continues to impact folks of color. I get a lot of doc students, not Colleen, but a lot of doc students who want to focus on white teachers, which is great at the end of the day. And they say they want to do a whiteness studies, a critical whiteness studies analysis on this. I say, well, let's think about your approach to critical whiteness. Is it just for these white teachers, or is the point here so that these white teachers can stop doing harm, whether intentional or not, the impact, not the intent, onto their students of color? So I think that's just an important aspect. Yes, and I'm just going to wrap up there, but thank you so much, Christi and Shona.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot to chew on, and I'm hoping people have. I see already, in any case, in the chat we've had some conversation starting already. Can I ask all of our presenters to please switch on your cameras, and then you can see each other. Colleen, on rather than off. Okay. Great. Okay. So something that's coming up quite a bit in the various inputs and also in the chapters, and I want to link it to our first question in the chat from Ditumiso Chilwane. And Ditumiso is saying, I've noticed myself, even that among my peers and the elders of my community, it is quite difficult to completely think independently of whiteness and its influence. And I want to link that to Bernard's chapter, where he talks about he poses a challenge to African philosophy in terms of thinking itself beyond whiteness. Is that possible? And I want to, because it was striking to me, Colleen, when you started, I think your opening words were something along the lines of race is permanent and whiteness will evolve. So that's quite a different positionality. And then in between, what I'm definitely seeing is a lot of twisting and turning. In my chapter with Shona, we actually talk about disturbed whiteness. It's very much, and as you know, we challenge the whole triad of invisibility, ignorance, and innocence, and we're saying invisible, ignorant, and innocent no more. And I think that a lot of the musings in this section actually also speaks to this disturbance that that whiteness and white subjects specifically, find themselves in. So but from your point of view, Colleen and Cheryl, it would seem as though this is a disturbance, but it will actually reassert itself. It will embolden itself, and so on. Well, from Bernard's point, I want to hear a bit more about. Is it possible to think oneself beyond it? Shall we kick off with that? Bernard, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yes, I will admit, Christi, that it's a very hard task, partially because of the pervasiveness of whiteness and the way that whiteness has managed to work itself into some form of normativity that's inescapable for everyone. So, for example, how Africans speak, whether it be accents or mode of expression in a European language, it's already something that does not permit one to think outside of whiteness. All my academic work is done in a European language. So how can I even posit the possibility of thinking outside something that is taken to be the fundamental normative driver of society, even what we do on a day-to-day basis? However, I think that real progress for the field that I'm concerned with, and probably with other fields like it, would lie in the power of imagination, that you can suspend this category and test how far you can go if it were something that you did not know at all. That will take a lot of power, and I think in that lies true freedom, because right now, even the freedom that we yearn for is not fully granted, yet it is within our realm really to claim it in such ways. So I'll admit it's a difficult thing, but it's not impossible. And if it were to be implemented, it will be fascinating to see what kind of results will be yielded, at least at the level of thought.
Thanks, Bernard. Aman, do you want to come in on the possibility of suspending whiteness, then at least?
So I think for me, Audre Lorde talks about this in Poetry is Not a Luxury. I think for me at this moment, what I think is that, in a way, is that the right question because of where we are? It may be for some people, but I think for me, what I think is thinking in that way suggests that there's a destination that we're like a pre-whiteness destination or something that we're trying to reach, right? And I don't know. Do I find maybe I will give you a different answer to this in a month's time. Call me and I will let you know. But right now, what I think is that being in conversation with this process is the most important thing. and bringing your, and I think that, I think what Bernard was saying about this being a creative process, I think for me the question is actually what is it that allows us to reach something within ourselves that feels whole and true? And that's where and you know, that those are such subjective terms, but I think when you're doing the work, you know, when you've got to that place, you know, that you find a magic in there somewhere, and that's where our best thinking comes. So I think that for me, maybe it's about trying to find the place that you feel most alive, when you're thinking possibilities into into, I guess, words even.
Thanks. Because and of course part of your critique is on even, you know, white subjects who are doing anti-racist work, how they reproduce whiteness even in those spaces with people who are racialized as not white, and that would sort of suggest that does that link to Colleen and Cheryl? Would that link to your position in terms of you know, which actually talks to an older critique also about critical whiteness studies, and that is this recentering of white people. And you were talking about the narcissism that one also sees. Cheryl, you were talking about the epiphanies, the white epiphany writing that became quite a stock in trade, I would say, during the 90s and even still. So is that sort of how whiteness then, one would see that as another way in which whiteness actually reproduces itself through adopting a critical position, but then ultimately just using it yet again to bolster whiteness. Cheryl?
I'm sorry, I thought Colleen was gonna take that one. Yeah, I think it's that's we always run into that. It's like a dialectical problem we have, right? As scholars, we conceptualize something that is supposed to be radical and new and cutting edge, and then as years go on, it gets watered down. I mean, I think I'm in teacher education, right? And oftentimes, when James Banks or Sonia Nieto first conceptualized multicultural education in the United States, you know, it was seen as cutting edge, and when they first conceptualized it, they talked about it being anti-racist. Yet decades later in teacher education, multicultural education became associated with shaking maracas and wearing a sombrero, you know, for Mexican American culture. So, you know, I think we run that risk, you know, and when I think Colleen has it right there in talking about utilizing critical race theory and saying that there's a permanence to race, and because there's such a permanence of race, that the evolution of race, and particularly that of whiteness and white supremacy, will evolve as well. So I think, Colleen, did you want to add more to that?
Well, I was going to comment on Christi's mention of white scholars, you know, working in critical whiteness studies, and how that maybe reifies the whole whiteness again and again and again, right? And that really brought up for me something that Bernard actually wrote, saying that basically that whiteness creates a prison of thought. I'm looking at it right here. I underlined it. Africans become imprisoned in categories that are predetermined by the effects of whiteness. And I appreciated that line because it's true of myself as a white person studying whiteness. I am imprisoned by whiteness. I have been, enculturated to it from, like Cheryl brought up Thandika, from birth. My white family, knowingly and unknowingly, instilled whiteness values in me, and I grew up around it. And I would say that even as I continually discover racist and white supremacist thoughts in my own cultural perception of everything around me, even as I'm able to notice them more and more. I wrote once in an article about the ephemerality of whiteness. Like, I see it and now I don't. I see it again, and then I can't see it anymore. And as a white person, I can't imagine. Well, imagine is the wrong word. I'd like to imagine a time where that doesn't happen anymore, but it's going to keep happening. And that is going to be the rest of my life. What will happen as a white person living, especially in the United States, I'm going to keep fighting against my own whiteness perpetually. So while I may like to imagine, as Aman said, a time maybe where that is, and Bernard is saying that's a powerful thing to try to do. It isn't going to end, and I think that's the quest, is to keep working and researching and trying to work on how to make that happen, so that the harm that this does to people of color worldwide is at the very least reduced as much as we possibly can in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you know what, Christi, it does remind me of Albert Memmi's work, the colonizer and the colonized, and we're talking about Bernard's work, in that you have the portraiture of a colonizer and the portraiture of a colonized, and you get these folks, the colonizer who resist, colonization, who know it's wrong. So you think about it like white abolitionists, white co-conspirators, white allies, whatever literature you want to term it. Yet he always makes the comment that when the state of colonization actually no longer exists, then the role of the anti-colonizer or something will be obsolete. So it does think, and we'd all lose our job if race was never, and as Ice Cube said, that would be a good day.
Great, yeah. Thanks. So in terms of this twisting and turning of white subjects, it seemed to me, Phillip, in terms of what you were presenting, it is very much, these are now white subjects who are clinging onto whiteness, and they're trying they're busy with a kind of a project of validation. I find some perhaps some resonance with what Samantha was presenting around, the attempts by white subjects to try and validate themselves. But your subjects that you're talking about, these are subjects that basically they want to hold on to whiteness for dear life, and they would even incorporate some leftist precepts to justify their position, to legitimize their position to themselves, and also then as a political project, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. That sounds rather nicely. Especially with that, and this is where talking about things like the kind of white racial epiphanies is useful, because so on the one hand, for like say looking at a Black whiteness studies, the idea is, okay, this is both sort of tiresome and maybe recentering, especially for many of the alt-right. They look at it as, the phrase that you'll sometimes hear is they'll say it's like a humiliation ritual, that in effect that this is going on. So they're embracing whiteness as, in their view, something this representative of a biocultural ethnos that has existed for 100 years, 1,000 years, depending upon who you're talking to, and that they tend to, to an extent, they would even look at they sort of question premises of sort of what we would talk about in something like whiteness studies, because the general view of it would be, indeed, if I remember right, I think Greg Johnson actually was one of the people who made this particular comparison. He said, what if we would look at Blackness, if we had a critical Blackness studies the same way we have a critical whiteness studies, where the aim of critical Blackness studies was to exterminate the evils of Blackness. We would presumably look at that as a highly negative, highly prejudiced in some ways sort of view. For the alt-right, they say it's just the same thing. This is anti-whiteness. And this is where they kind of try and shift the frame a little bit. So in terms of, again, when we talk about whiteness, again, usually it is as something that's containing us, harming others. This is where, to a certain extent, a little bit bronze-age pervert, a little bit, it's always funny saying these guys' names when you're actually saying it out loud, where they're pulling a little bit from Carl Schmitt's political theology. That in many ways, they're arguing that the way whiteness is now constructed in a neoliberal order under cultural hegemony of say more diversity or inclusive sort of views, effectively kind of takes on the role of Gnosticism in earlier periods, that whiteness has become the dark principle, the evil god, that its context is just evil. And this is something they say they want to take back. They want to say that whiteness is instead architecture, reason, science, so on and so forth. And oftentimes this is something that, in kind of going on this idea that this may give them some strength in terms of something like a right intersectionality that may come up later. One instance that came up about, say, a year ago, the Smithsonian Institute of the United States put up something on basically white privilege, things of that type, a popularized notion, but nothing that was really outside of it. And they had a field day with it, because they said, okay, so what is white supremacy? The rule of law, timeliness, being really focused on monotheism, which especially for someone in Qatar, my Muslim students found that really funny. The focus on, the focus on, say, time preference, things of that type. One of the ways they use this was to say, if this is white supremacy, do we need to reconsider if white supremacy is a good thing? Because what is the opposite? Lawlessness, lack of reason, paganism, things of this type. It was a useful thing to them, that effectively they're saying, okay, the things that are negative about whiteness, we're going to say these are positives. And if we talk to the general public outside of, say, an academic sort of sense, they could reasonably say that there are probably a good number of people who will be sympathetic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my own research shows how these things are equated with whiteness as a kind of it's part of the whole that's part of the project of the elevation of whiteness and attaching to itself all of these positive concepts, one could say, and positive ideas and so forth. And then, of course, the big thing is to claim rationality and to claim this as the supreme rationality. So, but just a second, because I want to, we are running out of time, unfortunately. Let me, I do want to bring in Samantha, because we haven't heard from you, Samantha. I haven't forgotten of you. Just to say, in terms of, if you want to say anything more also about the whole question of the overcoming of race, the overcoming of whiteness, and whether that's at all a possibility. And then Melanie Judge also asked or made a comment here in the comment and question in the chat, where she's saying fundamental to whiteness itself is the notion of the white subject as always already worthy, as having a life of inherent value, legitimacy, and livability. I'm not convinced that the moral conundrum of being or doing white at the existential level disrupts this racist logic. So the moral task must then be to be concerned with the unequal distribution of human value and worth, and what are whites to do with that, both inside and outside of themselves. So Samantha, I'd love to hear you on that. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Christy. I was just reading and thinking about Melanie's comments in the last few minutes. I think in answer to that, I'd like to make a distinction that's quite standard between different forms of self-respect. And I'd like to insist that one kind of self-respect is necessary for being a human being who can function at all. So what is sometimes called recognition, self-respect, is just a basic sense of one being worth something, being morally recognizable and morally considerable as a human being. And I think it's perfectly legitimate and necessary for us all to have that. So being a subject that is always feeling herself always already worthy, in Melanie's words, I think is required for everybody. Another kind of self-respect, sometimes called evaluative or evaluative self-respect, it's got other names, would be then respect that you have for yourself for fulfilling some other kinds of standards, being a good person in certain ways. And I think Melanie's quite right there, that white people have had that kind of sense of self-respect in a way that is problematic. Problem with whiteness, of course, historically, as we all know so well, has been the denial of the first kind of self-respect to everybody who isn't white. And that is precisely part of the problem. But I do not think that denying it to ourselves is a legitimate or even possible strategy. So I think there can be a little bit of leeway there in thinking about different kinds of terms in that way.
And you regard that as necessary in order to actually tackle. Is that one
Yes.
needs to adopt that position in order then to also do, for example, anti-racist work?
I do think so. And John Rawls at one point says that without self-respect, nothing may seem worth doing. If you have no self-respect for yourself, there doesn't seem to be much motivation or reason for making yourself a better person, for worrying about how you appear to others and how you are to other people. I think any kind of moral task, any kind of living together with others in a community of equals requires that basic sense of self-respect. That leaves open plenty of space for self-deception, for hatefulness, for legitimate loss of self-esteem, self-respect, legitimate worries about loss of integrity.
Thanks for that. Shona Hunter wants to come in. We've unfortunately, there's a lot that we still need to grapple with here, and we started grappling to some extent, but we're just completely out of time. It's one of those. But Shona, do you want to come in
or maybe I can do it at the beginning. Sorry, I was going to say maybe I can do it at the beginning of our next, so we can all have the comfort break and then bring Michelle and Bill in, to time. I can bring it in afterwards because it's a reflection, about our conversations that hooks into the shape of what I've just seen, actually, or what I've just been really intrigued by in our provocations section. So we can leave me for the moment.
All right.
Assuming everyone's sticking around.
Yeah, we are completely out of time, unfortunately. So I do hope that people will stick around, because the idea is for us to have our reflection session, engage with Michelle Fine and William Cross, and then further engage with one another as authors and editors. So if it's at all possible, this has been quite a jam-packed session, and so sadly time has overtaken us. But please stay on if it's possible for you. I'd really appreciate it.
So should we let everyone? Sorry, Christy, go on.
And then we'll reconvene here in about 5 minutes. So I'd say seven past the hour. And if people just want to stretch their legs and make a super fast cup of coffee and so on. Thanks. Thank you very much to the panel. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think we've just started to get to some difficult issues, and unfortunately, we'll just have to leave it there for the moment and hopefully take it up in our next session. Thanks. Yes, I have actually asked our library to purchase a copy, so just for the students there. So I'm hoping that William Cross and Michelle Fine are standing ready. Perhaps you can just switch on your cameras. And I'm going to hand over to Shona for our next session, which is well, it's basically our reflection session, and it draws on the epilogue in the handbook.
Christi, I'm unable to turn on video.
Yeah.
Okay, I've just asked you to start your video. I hope that will
Here
help.
you go. It's magical. Thank you so much.
All
Good.
right, wonderful. Okay, great. Oh,
And there's Bill.
wonderful, wonderful. Great to see you. Thank you again for really a wonderful epilogue also from my side. It's just a great read and a perfect rounding off, and we really appreciate. Well, I really appreciate the time and all the intellectual and emotional and so forth energy that went into that. Thank you so much to both of you. Let me hand over to Shona.
Brilliant, lovely. So this is very exciting as a session for all sorts of reasons. So we have got William E. Cross Jr. just there moving his camera. Do you want me? How do you want to be addressed during the session? I mean, have you got the microphone on?
You're on mute, Bill.
Bill. Okay, that's what I'm basically. That's what I'm.
Always Bill.
Yeah.
Bill is fine.
I know. Okay, that's
Or
good.
the amazing, brilliant Dr. Cross. Either of those.
Well, I might do some of that later too. So we've got William E. Cross Jr., who is Bill here, in the amazing red hoodie and with an office that looks somewhat like mine. Also, Michelle's has stuff around it, so I love that. And then we have Michelle Fine here. I don't even know how to do these introductions, but just very briefly. Yeah, I think so. So the reflection, before I introduce Bill and Michelle's kind of reflections that they will be speaking to for the next kind of 20 minutes, I just want to make bring the thing to the table that I was going to in the last session, because I actually think it connects very nicely to some of the things that Bill and Michelle are reflecting on in their epilogue, their reflections piece. And I was reflecting from the point of view of somebody who's been sat in our conversations over the past kind of 3 days. And I think we've seen a shift. So we started off the conversations really very explicitly situating whiteness in relation to ideas of power and articulations of power, whether they be material, affective, symbolic, and a bit of all of those things. And I think what we've seen quite interestingly over the couple of days is the way in which, when we move from beginning to articulate via understandings or critiques of power to kind of talking through whiteness itself, we almost follow the arc of how white supremacy kind of functions. And I think we've seen that very interestingly. And I think one of the things that the last session kind of brought home to me again was the importance of the histories and the spatialities that we are really interested in bringing into conversation with our subjectivities, our embodiments, and the other aspects of materiality that racialization and racism and as a form of oppression, domination, but also as a form of lived reality, kind of brings into play. So, I think the other thing I did want to say, and I would have nodded to, is there's something for me about the articulation of theory and theorizing. And I think, again, all of these issues, for me anyway, are raised in the epilogue, the reflections that Bill and Michelle have so generously provided for us in the volume. They've made some missing links. They've brought in some things that I was kind of hinting at, well, more than hinting at, in our first session, that my kind of unfulfilled wishes around thinking through materialities and institutionalizations in a particular way. But really, I think I'm going to just leave it to them, but Fanon, Sartre, racial capitalism, racial formation in the USA, just all sorts of things that they bring for us. So I think I'm going to leave it there and hand over. I don't know whether you've planned who I'm handing to first, Bill, Michelle, or great.
Take my hand.
Brilliant.
And then I'm going to leave a lot of time for my friend and colleague, Bill Cross. Let me, hello, everybody. Hello, Cheryl. It's good to see you always. There are some friends and new friends here. And so let me thank Shona and Christi for inviting me and then us to write an epilogue. Let me say it was a gift, a joy, a complexity when all those articles landed in our lives, and we got to bathe in them separately. And then to think together about how we wanted to, maybe in the language that Colleen offered us, to understand that the struggles are permanent, but what might we offer at this moment to move the conversation, to move the scholarship and the politics in directions where it's deepening and in directions where we think it has yet to move. Aman, we should tell you, I should tell you, your piece became just like a touch my heart, and I will get to that in a moment, but no need to apologize for who you're not, because who you are is extremely, extremely cool. So we can touch briefly on the papers that preceded us today and then talk to our epilogue, and I really want to leave most of the time for Bill. But let me just say a word on the papers that just preceded, and I'm going to use people's first names. Apologies if that isn't what you would prefer. But Bernard, I really appreciated your talk. We've been, I have a student from Beirut and a colleague who's African-American. The three of us are looking at where is Fanon in US psychology and trying to understand the systematic exclusion, silencing, and very selective use of Fanon in US psychological works, and how he has been excised from our discipline. And it struck me as parallel to your question of how is philosophy excised the African, what would philosophy look like if it didn't center whiteness? And it feels like a parallel question that we're asking about really the what Rayland Rabaka might call the academic apartheid of excluding Fanon Du Bois in US psychology. So they're very interesting disciplinary questions about the policing within our disciplines, whether it be philosophy or psychology. And Cheryl noted we just lost the amazing Charles Mills, who was a colleague of mine who really helped me think about the epistemic violence of such exclusions. So thank you for your talk. Aman, like I said, I just found love and so appreciated two aspects, one of which you spoke about today, but complicatedness as an analytic girlfriend, as something we should all be relying on rather than reproducing the binaries. And you wove that into a sense of how do we theorize love and solidarity, even when we are so fractured and broken by deep power inequities. And I appreciated that. That stretch, that yearning was not as apparent in the volume as I would have loved. And a lot of times that gets soppy. So I'm so glad the soppy parts weren't there. But you really, I sent your piece to my young daughter outlaw, a young Indian American sick woman, and she and I have been having conversations across your piece. So I wanted to thank you very much for that. Samantha, I really appreciated what you had to say today. I've been at Witwatersrand and I'm good friends with Jill Bradbury, and the complexities of what it requires to think through an identity that it is as one at once something we must undo and also figure out how we embrace, or I would say, what's the obligation of whiteness? I so appreciate how white South African colleagues struggle with this question in a context very different than my own. But I loved the language you brought to the questions about how does one salvage a kind of integrity, self-respect, and I would add obligation to interrogate privilege, but also solid or fragilarities. They're not so solid as Aman's piece suggests, but how do we be with and still interrogate the very the fragile grounds upon which our own identities are formed. And Philip, I want to reread your piece because I'm not sure I understood everything you were saying, but I do want to raise a question that maybe we could return to. I liked your notion of the migration of intersectionality. I am concerned that a version of supremacists that we see these days is not just separatism. It is control, it's censorship, it's a violent exclusion of, it's an insistence on white innocence of police who kill brown children, white innocence of who takes up arms during protests, walks through the streets and is not brought down by the police, a white innocence of truckers who have decided to mobilize their horns and their powers to, whether in Canada or the US or New Zealand, and I'm sure in other places. So who's mobilizing white women's position with dark money in this country to shut down culturally responsive education, queer education, critical race theory? So I'm seeing that we're at a moment of kind of mobilizing whiteness as innocence, victimization, and domestic care in the role of white woman, which is why I did that rant in the middle of the epilogue, a letter to Karen. Pardon me, I just had to, but I worried that something's mobilized that's about a fierce reclamation of power in the positionality of innocence. And then Colleen and Cheryl, I really appreciate how you're thinking hard about two pieces. One is, how do scholars of color, particularly Black scholars, get literally whited out of this field? And the second is, how do we think about subjectivity? And it's a question I want to return to because it feels to me like in the social sciences and in social movements, somehow we've collapsed the way we think about structural arrangements and subjectivities. And I wonder if we have to do that. I'm comfortable talking about white supremacy and policing and prisons and the economy and structural. And yet when I work with queer activists, for instance, young people of color who also identify as queer, they fight me fiercely around not imposing those categories on subjectivity. So I feel like where Cheryl and Colleen and Ama is really struggling around, why do we have to use the same language, talk about structural categories and subjectivities without, to go to Samantha, letting anybody off the hook? But I feel like we've collapsed those. All right, that was unarticulate. I want to say the gifts. The gifts of the volume are many. the gifts of the volume is that you two sketched a landscape and came up with the most beautiful cover, just a stunning, shocking cover of the book. Diverse by theoretical positionality, activists, artists, writers, theorists, researchers, teachers, and then geographically. And you organized the book in a way that tried to teach us. And I appreciated that, because if you get to read the whole volume, it's a lot of very different kind of pieces. And you tried to create, I don't know, do you all have that drawer where you have t-shirts that you don't want to throw away, but they really have nothing in common with each other? Like, that's what it felt like. Like, I loved it, but so you tried to kind of curate the volume in a way that it had a coherence, or at least a structure, so that you were teaching us. I want to frame where Bill and I are old friends who have done a lot of work together, and mostly I've learned a ton working with Bill, but where we yearned for more. Or I'm sure right now you're starting the second volume. So I'm sure you have lots of time on your hands for the second volume, and there should be many free copies at Nelson Mandela University Library. So here are the places where we would wish for more. One is whiteness as structural innocence, a point I referenced earlier. It just feels like we are watching an explosion of enactments of whiteness as innocence. Yesterday, there was a picture and the headline was babushka ladies with large rifles. And it was women in Ukraine who took up, and it was kind of, the desire was for me to love those women. And I've seen that same picture of Muslim women, of Black women and men. And it's not calling for, this is justifiable violence. In the same way that all of Fanon's writings on violence have gotten excised from the academy. So whiteness as innocence, it happens every time a cop shoots a kid. The George Floyd, Derek Chauvin case being maybe the exception. But the ways in which whiteness as structure kind of laminates from culpability. And I'm doing some work with a bunch of friends, most of whom are formerly incarcerated women, and we're looking at domestic violence and its relationship to the criminalization of women. And let me put this simply, the white women who can argue that they were experiencing domestic violence have a different patina attached to their body. They read as worthy victims who maybe deserve a second chance in a way that Black women who are in prison and have been criminalized, or even Latinx, there's not the kind of, even in my own body, the like, what's she doing in prison? So that lamination really deserves attention. A second is how white logics operate through the neoliberal systems that we are vulnerable to, and probably are being named in the strikes at your universities. And again, I'm hesitant to call it white logics, and Bill is going to unpack this, but logics that end up benefiting people who are white, right? Logics of innocence, logics of worthiness, logics of whose families should be invaded by child protective services, whose families get to be invaded by police. So there's just a neoliberal white logic that is operating through our universities. I was just on, the reason I was late was so many of my students of color are being told you have to leave your ethnicity, your language, your heritage at the door when you come into class. And our guest speaker was Puleng Sakalo, who's at UNISA, where I am also privileged to be on the faculty. And she was talking about we can't divide ourselves that way. We can't sever our interior, and we must insist that the university recognize our full selves. So, so understanding white logic, symmetric madness. The third speaks back to Samantha's point. I guess I would like us to be thinking about the obligations of whiteness, not just the, what did you call it, Cheryl, white enlightenment or white moments or aha moments, but the obligations, or maybe the obligations of white academics, right? To interrupt, to name, to dismantle, to challenge, and also to create spaces where we know our students are often struggling for a language to be in the game and are terrified. And so it's double duty. And I guess the final, 2 more points. The next point is distinguishing the structural operations of whiteness and the complex subjectivities that Aman was asking us. And I think Samantha was asking us, Samantha, when you said, I am importantly white, but I am not only that. Like, that can sound like, that can be read as she's denying blah, blah, blah. I did not hear it that way. I heard it as, how does one recognize what it means for me to walk across the street and police to say, good afternoon, how can I help you? Knowing that the young people of color I work with are getting beaten by the same police. Like, how do I know both of those things? How do I know that when my Black foster son is struggling with Child Protective Services, that when my white body enters that conversation, everything shifts? How do I use my whiteness to interrupt those dynamics and not become a savior, even though the theater's already set up? So how do we think about the structural and the complex subjectivities without collapsing them? And the last and really most vital piece is where I'm going to turn to my colleague, Bill Cross. We hoped that the book would engage and struggle around the relationship of whiteness and racial capitalism. And I'm going to let Bill, who's very much a scholar of all things Black identity, critical race, subjectivities, and most recently, race capitalism. So thank you, Bill, for joining me, and I'm open to all kinds of questions. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes, thank you. With the pandemic, I found myself realizing, let me back up again. With the Black Lives Matter movement, they ended up with an agenda of, say, I don't know the exact number, let's say 10 items, including issues of culture, statues, what have you. And I realized that elites could cherry pick some of these things so that they end up taking away the statues, maybe taking away some of the most explicit examples of racism and sexism and so on. And yet the great mass of working class Black people would still be unemployed. So I tried to figure out, it just almost, the book helped me to flash a light on the way in which capitalism has used race as a divide and conquer mechanism. And all I can do with the short amount of time I have is to give you a little bit of the chapter, and then I hope it draws you into the chapter. And my work is somewhat descriptive rather than analytical, if we can make that division. But I found it amazing that working class white people could vote for Donald Trump. It just blew my mind. And that they could wrap themselves in the Confederate flag. When, if you go back to history, you discover that the owners of the forced labor camps, known as plantations, that in a sense, they did not want working class people to have the vote. And in fact, during the antebellum period, white workers were viewed as surplus labor, to be somehow contained and manipulated. So they passed vagrancy laws that allowed them to arrest working class whites who did not own property, force them into prison, and then the law would allow them to be farmed out, hired out to elites at a salary that almost guaranteed that they would remain poor. And then after the war, white workers became sycophants. It's amazing that they were told that at least you are not Black. We will always view you as somehow above Black people. Now, this did not last very long, because in the coal miners' strike of 1891, there was no hesitation to use just brute force to break up the strike. And this included Gatling guns. And actually, this is mind-blowing, actually having people fly up in planes and drop bombs on the workers, which they eventually succumbed in order to break up the union. And in a more modern sense, when we tried to discuss social support systems for workers who were unemployed, it was white workers who were hesitant to be supportive of these kind of gestures, because they had in their mind the notion of the worthy poor and the unworthy poor. You know, where the hell does that come from? That somehow Black people and brown people were unworthy, and we don't want to give too much. And this was a major obstacle to the passage of the Obamacare and for its expansion, that you had white workers actually becoming sycophants to elites who were trying their best to hold down the amount of social safety net that would be shared. And that perhaps the most mind-blowing thing to discover is that white workers actually were arguing that somehow women, particularly feminists and people of color, somehow owned the economy, had large pieces of the economy, and they were somehow to explain the unemployment of white workers. So my piece tries to make this connection between whiteness and economics, and whiteness as a tool for dividing and conquering. And I think for the most part, I show where it's been relatively successful. And of course, we tried to suggest that imagine a chapter written by Jane Mayer and the late Manning Merrill as a contribution to a future volume. And so in my work, I try to argue that there's a cultural piece to whiteness, there's a fantasy piece to whiteness, and so on. But when it gets down to the majority of people in the United States who are wage earners, that the most important thing about whiteness is its capacity to turn economics into a racial discourse. And therefore, racial capitalism is so critical. And we didn't mean for this to be some sort of a dig into the text, but we just found that wanting. And in my work, when you turn to it, you'll see I try to give example after example of how successful capitalists have been in miseducating white workers, in turning them into allies, especially at the political level, as opposed to unions presenting a counter narrative to their agenda. I think that would be the way I would summarize it, Michelle. And I feel as though we're getting close to running out of our time.
Well done. Thank you. All to say we loved it. All to say we loved it. We wanted more.
Oh, well, because I was going to say you weren't actually. Everyone's been so well behaved with their time today. I kind of can't quite believe it, but maybe, I mean, look, can I take a bit of a privilege here as one of the editors, actually, because I think one of the things that you're speaking to, it's brilliant. I'll come back to Michelle's question. Cheryl's question or comment. But I think it's really interesting because the kind of gaps in a way that both of you feel, and your chapter, because in a way I almost see it. I know you are at pains to say it's not a main chapter, but actually for Christi and I think I'm sure Christi will be able to speak from her own point of view in a moment, but we were so pleased to receive your reflections, partly because of what they highlighted, that had things turned out differently, and I'll talk about that in a moment, with the editing of the volume, there would have been more of in the volume. And I think this is really perhaps points to precisely the fissures and the collapses that you're, well, fissures, gaps, collapses, absences that you're both talking to in relation to the epilogue, in relation to what you were just talking to about around racial capital.
But notice we got there because we read the book. I mean, in a sense,
totally, yeah,
just totally blew my mind. I mean, I'm 82, and I still would argue that this is reading the book and having this responsibility was a major help to me, a major change in my own thinking, as shown in a couple of pieces, not including the chapter.
Wow!
So thank you.
No, I mean that's really great. But what I was actually going to say was, let me throw this in and then I'll open it out, because I'd like to see how people engage. But we asked a lot of people who worked in that area to contribute to the book, and we never know why people don't choose to do things, and various reasons are given, and but I sense in my own work, particularly, I work in the area of the state. I work precisely in these issues. And I think it's interesting that people who work in the state either see me as a really weird scholar of the state, or somebody who does critical whiteness studies. And it's kind of something that that I highlighted in a different sort of way, actually, from a personal point of view at the beginning of the session. So I think there is something really important substantively and theoretically and politically that you're pointing to in that epilogue. And to hear Fanon, to hear what you were just saying, Michelle, about Fanon and his expunging, I've got a review to do of a book from a social psychology perspective. I won't mention what it is, actually, because I'm doing the review, but I don't think they use Fanon, but they use all sorts of other stuff to try and do this work. And I'm like, why aren't we doing that? So anyway, sorry, I'm taking far too much of a privilege now, but for me, it's very exciting. Yeah, Christi, I'll bring you in, because I do see the intellectual work that you were doing in that epilogue and that you've done for us today as absolutely crucial. And I love, Bill, that you said that it comes from the book, because in a way, totally, that makes sense to me. And I think we did our job, but it still doesn't stop my wishes not being entirely fulfilled. So I'm going to hand over to Christi, and then I promise I will share out so that we get more conversation.
Right, yeah, thank you so much for those for the epilogue, for your very thoughtful comments. Just in terms of the question of racial capitalism, my first book actually is called White Power and the Rise and Fall of the National Party, and it actually looks exactly at racial capitalism in South Africa. Of course, South Africa, I think, would be a primary one of the primary exemplars of how this kind of capitalism plays itself out, with very much from the word go, in terms of, after the discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 19th century, and when the kind of shift into modernity and the whole modernization project, establishing the state and so forth and so on, it became immediately extremely even more important. So before you had obviously an organization, a colonial organization of indigenous people in ways that were extractive and so on. But the minute we shifted into that really like capitalist, mining capitalism phase of our economy, you see how important it becomes actually to control Black people's bodies, and particularly because you've got deep level mining, and which is very dangerous. And it became extremely important from this, from the point of view of these capitalists to be able to exploit and extract labor from particularly Black male bodies, and to the extent that if you actually look at the wage levels in the mining sector for Black men, for Black mine workers who form the bulk of the workforce, they were actually lower in the early 1970s than in 1920. So you see actually how this extraction worked over those decades, and the only way that that could be possible was, of course, through this systematized racism and sort of intensifying the colonial system of segregation into apartheid in 1948, and so on. And so that book goes into that whole history quite intensively. But in terms of my own work, I have shifted to try and understand class also in a kind of a constructive way, an intersectional way in relation to race and so forth. And so the chapter on the competitive relationship between Afrikaner masculinities and white English-speaking South African masculinities tries to get at that, where the mobilization of Afrikaners through Afrikaner nationalism very much was a class project to elevate Afrikaners out of what was called the white poor problem, and particularly in relation to your British or English settler class. So just to add that, it's a main concern for me in my own work, and I was hoping that chapter would specifically address at least the South African situation in this regard. And then, as you noticed, of course, the Begum Monden winter chapter did also particularly talk about what you're talking about, Bill, in the sense of the miseducation of the white working class in Britain. And there are obviously quite strong parallels to be made with the States in that regard. We did approach Matt Ray as somebody whose work I've actually enjoyed, to bring in this class dimension as well. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to contribute. So, I'm thinking, Shona, shall we open?
Yeah, I'm going to bring
in relation to some of Michelle's comments. I'm sure Cheryl would like to respond. Colleen, Philip, would you like to come in, Cheryl?
Yeah, shall I? Yeah. Do you want me to carry on chairing? Is that what you're saying? That's right.
Let me just say that if Bill and I were asked to speak or write an epilogue on a Marxist reader on class, we would quickly, I'm sure, make the same argument like, where's race and gender? So the fact that these fields are so bifurcated is a huge problem in the labor movement. It's a huge problem in scholarship. And yet it's at those rich intersections that Manning Marable, that Fanon, that Du Bois later in his life began to articulate. Sorry.
No, that's,
take your point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a bit worried about time, so shall we bring in
Cheryl?
No, I just had a question for them.
Yeah.
Do I have to, you want me to read it aloud, teacher?
I want you to explain it.
Yeah.
I want you to unpack it a little.
Oh, well, I'm just curious, when you talk about intimacies, you're talking about things that are always interconnected, things that are tied together. Yet I know there's increasing resistance in different types of theories that think it's anti-Black to do so. So I was just wondering if you've experienced that in a lot of the work that you're doing and seeing that, and just how you wrestle with that concept.
Say more. Anti-Black to assert the interdependence or intimacies, or
I think some of the critiques that are coming in, and rightfully so.
I think I know what you're saying a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So,
go ahead.
So what Manning Marable has wrote on this extensively, and yet he was not embraced, because there was this misconception that somehow if you slide over to a materialist discussion, you're sliding into a white domain. And so there was almost a hesitancy to embrace his work. And more recently, I've been writing, and as I bring in more of social class issues, I'm almost anticipating some rejection by some of my colleagues, because somehow that's a white thing. So if I'm understanding you, I believe I would say yes. But that's our challenge. I mean, right now, for example, in order to elevate, or whatever word we want to use, assist Black working class people, it has to go through a political process that won't make the division by race per se, and yet it requires, therefore, white workers to be on board, and they're not. And so you have this irony that in order to assist Black workers, brown workers, in some cases women workers, you have to convince white male workers that they should be more attuned to their class interests. And the United States has set up a scenario, especially with Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I, where he almost made it a bad thing for you to be on the left. Somehow, if you were on the left, you're anti-American. And then McCarthyism helped to revise that. We have a tough time as Americans talking about unions and the left. It's just somehow you're being un-American if you do so. And then, boy, if you throw in the issue of race, it gets even worse. So if I'm understanding you, yes, I'm finding as I evolve, I'm 82 and I'm evolving into a more materialist position, that I'm almost anticipating the blowback from some of my colleagues who think race is the issue, it's race-centric, make it race, and if you go beyond that, somehow you're not doing your job.
Yeah, I think this is really helpful. I'm wondering, I was going to bring in the bit about Afro-pessimism specifically, but I think maybe I'll do that in a moment after we bring some of the other authors in, because I think this, the way that the conversation has moved, maybe, and particularly this broader point about the bifurcation, whether it's in terms of the US context and issues around skepticism around the left and unionization, and that, which I think actually work very well in the English context as well now, and other contexts probably because of neoliberalization. But I think there's something around maybe a set of bifurcations that are happening in terms of theory, in terms of politics, in terms of the way we understand the human, the way we understand academic work. So I'm wondering, and actually it speaks back to, I don't know, Samantha, you're a green S at the moment, I think, maybe, I don't know, somebody, don't know. I don't know whether the rest of the authors want to maybe from the last, yes, you are a green S. You want to turn on your cameras, and maybe if you wouldn't mind, if you have reflections, and also, of course, this relates to Philip also, the kind of, Michelle, you directly asked something specific that was quite large but very specific and relates to this bifurcation, I think, or how it slides. So sorry, I was trying to say, I think everyone's got something to say here. So Aman, you nodded many times. So I'm just going to bring you in as and Bernard, I don't know whether you're there or not. I can see.
I'm trying to figure out what the question is. Am I the only one?
Well, okay, let
me read the whole book and see if it's the same thought.
I think what I'm trying to do is make a connection between this discussion, which has come up in a number of ways across the 3 days, and of course everybody hasn't been there, but the disconnection or the differences between articulations of race and class is how it gets commonly articulated. But I think that maps onto and relates to the sorts of bifurcations that you are pushing against. I mean, Michelle mentioned, you see, I was riffing off you, Michelle. There was a lot of bifurcations that Bernard, I think the same. I mean, where Bernard started us today was just absolutely brilliant. I can't quote it now, but I loved it. And I think it cuts into that. So yes, did that help?
Yeah, let me make an observation.
Go.
Sure.
So King, it's interesting that when King was murdered, it was when he was pushing the Poor People's March.
Yeah, absolutely.
In effect, if you can imagine his being successful in bringing Black and white poor people to Washington, D.C., I mean, that's when he really became a threat. In Obama, when he talked about saving the banks, everybody was on board. As soon as he raised the specter of actually helping individual homeowners, many of whom would have been people of color, no way. And Mandela talked about freedom in a political sense, but he didn't really have it. I shouldn't say he didn't have an agenda, but he didn't push for the reconstruction of the economic order. So there's a way in which it's amazing. Capitalism can hide behind the bushes, and yet at certain points it just explodes itself. And for us, the pandemic really showed it. People were losing their jobs, and yet they were racializing who got the job first or not. Absolutely amazing. Instead of, even though the majority of people were working class people, they couldn't figure out a way to have a common agenda. And they kept electing people who were not really speaking to their agenda. It's an amazing phenomenon. Descriptively, it's almost like a Saturday Night Live skit or something that Dave Chappelle and Monty Python. But it's reality. The majority of people can't figure out in our country how to have a social safety net that reasonably helps people when they're in pain. And instead, we get to a discourse on feminism and race. It's amazing. That's a really powerful ability if you think about it. But it saves people from having to share. I mean, in a sense, the 1% is gobbling up all the goodies. They're outrageously rich. I don't know. It's just mind-blowing to think about the actual amount of resources are now controlled by such a small percentage of the people.
Can I come in here with a very,
go on.
It's very tentatively, because bringing psychological issues to structural issues, I know very little about. But it has always struck me as completely bizarre how working class whites have not allied with working class black and brown people, where the interests are basically so aligned. And it seems also that there's a very skewed sense of integrity and self-respect around work here, that there's a wrong kind of notion of self-respect as tied to the wrong sorts of things. And that if we have a more nuanced view of what self-respect consists in or could consist in relation to other people, seeing your self-respect as tied into a common fate with other people, that would be more productive. Because it seems, listening to what Phillip was saying and quite a few other people in the panel, that giving up on whiteness or accepting the power of social capital that whiteness brings seems to leave a vacuum. What else is there if I'm not that? There's nothing for me to respect if I give up that identity. So how to rethink virtues of character and basic psychological necessities of decency in relation to capital, to power structures, seems to me interesting and very, very difficult. And I wouldn't know how to do it. But luckily, that's not my job.
Aman, I don't know whether you would speak to that actually. Lay that on you, but given that you do.
We keep giving you different things to respond to. What's on your heart, Aman?
So I guess just my reflections on the discussion so far, we're talking about bifurcation. Ultimately, dichotomies are the bread and butter of normative thinking. It isn't new. And actually the way that it's playing out in our society right now, like we had roadmaps for this stuff. It's called totalitarianism. We know where this is going to go if it plays out, if there isn't a disruption, right? For me, it's the disruption that is the thing to talk about in a way. I think that how we live, I guess for me, how we live relationally, it feels so banal, right? To say that the disruption is, well, I don't know. I think probably any way of talking about a disruption to this is banal in a sentence or two, right? I think the interesting thing for me is how do we live this in the everyday? How do we live our values in the everyday? How do we turn thinking disruption or thinking otherwise into a practice for our lives? That's where the real work is. You know, it's about taking a simple sentence and about applying it anew in every situation in which we live, right? It's that creativity that is the work. And that's really hard to speak to, I think, in an hour or two. Like, this is, the work is relational, like across, is expansively relational. And I think that the meaningful stuff happens in the continued conversation or the continued relationship, right? I guess just the last thing to say really quickly, so in my work at the moment, I work for a national mental health charity at the moment. I've always worked in the NGO sector, third sector, whatever people want to call it. And we're doing, I guess, off the back of Black Lives Matter, and I guess a movement to racial equality. You know, when we were talking about racial capitalism, the place that I went is actually like, how do we stop? And when we're talking about institutions, it's like, how do we stop the racial capitalism of this moment and the mining of people of color in this move towards anti-racism? I think activists do it much better than kind of maybe organizations that are more normative in their everyday. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking through at the moment. It's just, how do we do this anti-racist work meaningfully in normative spaces? Yeah, I don't know, that's really difficult. But that's, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Shona, could I ask that we bring Bernard in?
That was just
we
what I was
haven't heard from him in a while, and I'd actually love to hear, Bernard, just your how you understand this interaction between class and race, because, you know, of course, in South Africa, if we look just at the history here, you know, how they were, in fact, in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, there was a strong opportunity, actually, exactly for that kind of interracial alliance within the working class, which didn't happen. White supremacism actually did get the upper hand there. And how do you understand this tension between the two, and how, in a sense, subjects were almost wrested away, how the socialist imaginary couldn't sort of exert the same traction as ultimately as the imaginary of white supremacism?
Thank you so much, colleagues. Thanks, Christi. Thanks, Shona. I was beginning to imagine my glass of wine, so I was kind of switching off, but now you bring me to the real stuff.
You and me both, Bernard.
It's for us to be drinking.
Oh my goodness.
But you take me back to when I was really young, like 18 or 19, sociology 1. And one of the things that we were taught there, I've never pursued class in any meaningful way beyond undergraduate instruction. And one of the things that we were taught there was how class itself is also framed by realities of race. That the working class is not a uniform category. So I'm relying on my professors of sociology, and so and I was convinced. That's why I repeat this. I was convinced. They say to us, anyway you come across, I think it was from the Marxian tradition, anyway you come across class also incorporates issues of race in it. So the European or white working class is never quite the same as the Black working class, because the European or white working class also depends for its whatever comfort as the white or European working class on the successful exploitation of the Black working class. And I think that is a real hindrance to the unification of people in these classes, because within the working class itself, generally there's a hierarchy of whatever positions and who can legitimately occupy those positions. So whoever is called the big boss, if we were to use the South African lingo, whoever is called the big boss amongst the working class will be someone who is not black. It will be somebody who's white, somebody who's colored, and recently we've seen it will be somebody who is foreign, somebody who is a Zimbabwean like me, who is put in charge of Black South Africans, and that's creating a different category of what a working class person is. It's so funny because I had an incident recently where somebody was looking for a job in a restaurant here in South Africa, in Pietermaritzburg, where I live. And the owner of the restaurant, who is a white man, asked her, where do you come from? And we know what that question means. When she responded from Zimbabwe, then he said, you are not meant to work on the shop floor. You can't be a waitress. You are meant to manage. And those distinctions are there. And those distinctions also hinder the possibility of creating a unified working class. But most importantly, I think the point has been made and I agree with it. White people in general, unless in forums like these, will never recognize themselves to be genuine equals to Black people. If their struggles can be identified with Black struggles, an element of whiteness has been taken away from them. And they can't stand that. In the town that I live, which is a university town, we've got a place that was formerly a military barrack, but it's now a dumping. It's not a shanty town. It's not bad, but it's a dumping site for failed whites and Blacks who are trying to strike it in the city. So you see that combination: failed whites and Blacks who are just trying to strike it in the city. And the whites from that part of the city are called Oribites. It's right next to the airport, which is called Oribi Airport. The whites are called Oribites, and they hate that term. But the Blacks in that part of the city are not called Oribites, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I do not think that genuinely Black struggles and white struggles can ever coincide in any forum. I think those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Can I ask you something, Bernard, actually, because I think it relates to, I mean, for me, where you started us off at the very beginning of the previous session is so helpful, I think, in terms of thinking and practicing ourselves potentially out of, well, I'm going to stick with those words because they're the ones that have come to me, but out of the, I know that's not really what I mean, because I don't think we can out of in any uncomplicated way, but, you know, your whole chapter, you know, why is African philosophy, it does not exist outside, in fact, it only exists in that contained way because of, God, where's the stuff? I wrote up in a blog, actually, the stuff from yesterday, and I used it, Yancey's notion of, come on, help me out, folks, not got it here, I screwed it up, it's on the computer, but basically, oh God, is the blog in front of me? It might be in front of me. No, is it? Yes, it is. So Yancey would say, and I brought this up the other night, which is why I feel okay to bring it up now, past Erasmus, an established white ontology. In fact, you might have used it, Bernard, in your chapter. You know, the point is we are racially, for me anyway, and that you showed us so powerfully, is we are defined as humans in racialized ways, and that is why capitalism works in the sorts of ways that Bill is so well shown, and that's why we're stuck in these logics, I suppose, if that's even the right word. Sorry, I can't remember what my question is. You got me so exercised, but I kind of think you're answering this for us at the beginning in a way. I don't know whether I'm of last.
Just one short observation. Right now, the United States has created an economy where there are no jobs for people who have a high school degree or less. So even if whites try to racialize that situation, The fact of the matter is, how do we create an economy where working class people have worth, or how do we transform them? And I understand that race will jump in there. I understand what Bernard is saying, but right now it's a level playing field. Everybody's unemployed, and people are having struggle to recognize that.
Bernard, there's another issue that you raised, that at one point you said in that town, when you talked about failed whites and aspiring blacks, which is it's powerful. You could see on people's faces in the very different places we all live. We know that town. And it strikes me that part of the subjective frame of dominant categories, whiteness, maleness, straightness, sorry for the binaries I'm on, let me do it for 30 seconds, that part of those identities is about who I am not, and insisting on the other. And it happens in gender, it certainly happens with heterosexuality, it happens with race, it happens with class, and it's a predatory, extractive identity, which I don't actually notice is as apparent in the more subordinate group, who kind of likes who we are. I mean, there are lots of women who hate other women, there are Black people who hate other Black, but not so identified against, I'm not gay, I'm not a woman, I'm not a this. And you can hear it in those truckers, right? There's a kind of virulent white masculinity about, I will not let you define me, and I am better than. And it's a challenge then to imagine a struggled solidarity where my identity is not premised on not being you, or where a white man's identity is not whatever, or your identity. So all these groups are also beating their women, right? So if we really wanted to be as intersectional as we should be in this conversation, we have to think about how that othering is operating across all of those categories. But there is something very, and I think Toni Morrison has spoken about this, very extractive about dominant categories that require an othering in the abstract. Obviously, individuals vary, but require an othering. And if I lose that, it's like an amputation of self, which is a striking point that you raised, Bernard, and a terrible social disability for all of us. Go ahead, you were going to say something.
Yes. Thanks, Michelle, for that. The last physical conference I attended, I presented something on homosexuals in Africa. And it's a category that also interests me pretty much like race, because it's discrimination. And I based my entire argument on fear and loathing. Because this is what is at work, both with discrimination against homosexuals or bisexuals or trans or whatever the categories are, and with race. You see, in South Africa, maybe Christi can help me to pronounce it properly, because I don't think my pronunciation will be correct. There was a fear by white males to be called a kafa buti, something like that, that they will be identified, which it's correct, okay. Yeah, which is a white man who's identified as either a sympathizer or a friend of Black people. And it's the worst condemnation, because what it shows is that now the white man has not only treated a Black person as a human being who is worthy of the title, but has come to understand the Black person so much that they can befriend them. The same applies to fear of homosexuals. Many heterosexual African men fear understanding what it means to be homosexual, because they think the moment they understand, they will be converted, like a white man can be converted to being a Black man, and a heterosexual African male can be converted to being a homosexual African male. So you're absolutely right, and I agree. Maybe it's a human thing. Maybe we want somebody in anthropology or who can tell us about how we evolved, because we rely on fear so much, and we love to use it to make a statement about who we are. And who we are is understood by being very explicit about who we are not. Yeah.
I was involved in a lawsuit about a mostly white boys university in the United States. It's called the Citadel. It's in South Carolina, and it's a public university, and they excluded women. Okay, long story. So some girls sued to get in. So I went down and I talked to all these young men, and what they told me is that in every barracks, there is a boy who gets turned into the skirt, the Sally, and it gets more derogatory, right? He gets turned into the girl who is not present. And then he's beaten up and terrible things happen to him. And it might be the most feminine boy or not, but the category got created in the exclusion of real women. And I went to the head of the counseling center and I said, something's quite wrong. In all of these barracks, there's a young man who gets targeted as and treated as the gay person, the girl. And he said, oh, the its. Yes, every barrack has an it, and we run an it support group, which I thought made me crazy, right? And then I started writing about all male academies the way I have about all white institutions, as defining themselves oppositionally to who is absent. And a friend of mine said, before you finalize that thought, come visit St. Benedict's, which is an all-Black boys' school in Newark. And that felt like a very different context. Like they were defined by who they were and not who wasn't present. So I think we have to think about these dynamics as plastic and workable rather than a human obligation to derogate those beneath us, but it is an aspect of dominant categories to be defined by a fear of losing the part of themselves that they have projected onto the other.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Can I bring in Philip, because he's I was going to bring in Philip and then Colleen if she's still around anyway. I don't know, cameras. Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, Philip, why don't you come in with what you were going to come in with, and I'll check it that you said what I thought. And Aman's got something for you here as well.
Makes sense. Particularly with this, I mean, I wager one of the issues, especially when talking about things like racial capitalism or class or so forth, and this is where the alt-right broadly understood is useful. Because, I mean, this is going to sound kind of blunt, forgive me. But in terms of this, let's say Greg Johnson or Jared Taylor was listening here. They would say, this is absolutely amazing. Because you all are doing the exact same thing you're accusing your opponent of. That you're otherizing. How could these people possibly vote for Trump? How could they be so stupid? These guys who are the truckers, they're beating their wives on the side as well. They're just doing these sorts of things that effectively the sort of alt-right position would say, in terms of dominance, we are the ones being othered because, say, in this conversation, we don't have any alt-right people here. If I'm thinking to myself, people who could potentially count as alt-right who are in the academy of the Anglo-speaking world, I can think of maybe 5 off the top of my head, and 2 of them are emeritus. They aren't here. We are kind of speaking into a vacuum, and again, kind of that initial concern of mine of that in effect, we're kind of making the enemy that's convenient. We're making the enemy that the villain or the moron who's helpful to us, but without necessarily hearing what they have to say. So in terms of something like, say, issues of money, for instance, the BLM movement and activities in 2020, for much of the alt-right, this became very much a factor. There was a general sort of joke they oftentimes would use. Obviously, they like using jokes as part of the meme warfare is kind of their big thing. But when they were looking at, say, when movement starts up and you start having many of the, especially multinational corporations saying, okay, we're going to send some money to try and assist with this. We're going to show that we do care, that Black Lives Matter and all that. Much of the alt-right started laughing because the response was, imagine that you have the same politics as Google, Burger King, Nike, and major banks and JP Morgan and still think you're speaking truth to power. Imagine you're doing that. Now, admittedly, one of the reasons why they're also mocking this way is because, so kind of like on the topic of censorship and so forth, again, many of these people are anonymous because they know they lose their jobs if they actually use their names, versus most of us who can freely say whatever we wish, take down the white supremacist mode without having to worry about losing our state-sponsored university positions. For them, they would say that effectively this is projection, that it is our fear of them.
Could I?
Now, no, please go ahead.
Well, I think I'd like to unpack some of what's going on in the conversation for me, actually, because I think what tends to happen is there's I don't know whether this is the collapse you were talking about, Michelle, between structure and agency, or I don't know whether you quite put it like that, but we're slipping between talking about individuals, talking about groups, and talking about systematized processes, but we're not really articulating at what points these switches are happening. And I think for me, this, maybe that's not fair. Maybe I'm not hearing us articulating, or we're not articulating together the points at which the switches are happening. And I think for me, this is how whiteness does work as a form of domination, which might not necessarily be the same as whiteness as a form of identification, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm Samantha, I don't know whether you're there or not. Still all I can see is the green square, and Bernard, everybody's been very good with turning their cameras off all of a sudden. But I think this is very important because to me, otherwise what's happening is we're collapsing intentioned capitalizing in resource terms and emotional terms and literal, terms on violence and domination, and the investments that I might make as a person in the way that was being articulated via Yancey again, only in the different piece, the elevator piece. I mean, I use that in my own work in a different sort of way. And I don't know whether it was you, Michelle, that was using that. Definitely Cheryl was using that example. But I think this matters because I think otherwise we're all talking, sorry, I don't mean to flatten the conversation, but I think there's cross-purpose talking, and I think if we bring it together, it gives us a way to cut into thinking about what might be done, not necessarily what might be resolved, because I don't know about that, but what might be done. Philip, can you? I don't know whether you can speak to that, and then maybe Colleen, because you've not said anything for a while at all, really, Colleen. So, but
actually, yeah, I personally would like to hear what Colleen has to say too, honestly. So
I've been here this whole time. I assure you, I have this baby that is, around. So sometimes I'm like, let me not distract everyone with her shenanigans. I was thinking about Edward Said and some of that early being, 78 or so, work on othering, and just how, like, Philip, I think you brought up some, an example of like the alt-right for, that's something that you wrote about, but they would say that we're engaging in that othering right now, by saying you're acting in a way that we don't like, or how could you're acting outside of your own interest, that race class analysis. When othering it's like so many of these things, it's a paradox, right? It's both beneficial to our analysis and it's harmful. It's beneficial because it helps me see the harm being done to someone. If I can say that, hey, this is, I am privileged as a white woman. If I get pulled over, I'm probably going to get out of it. Like probably the police officer is going to be like, oh, ma'am, where are you rushing off to? Soccer practice, and I'm going to get that treatment, and I'm pretty sure of it. And if I can otherize, if I can other someone else's experience, that helps me see the discrimination that's happening, right? So othering is not an inherently evil thing. It helps me to understand it, especially coming from a place of privilege. And it's also what you're saying, I think, Phillip, is that othering can be harmful because it creates discrimination by talking about it, which I think is where I was coming in with the race evasion idea. If we ignore it, if we say it's not real, we can't fix it. And again, that fixing is the imagining, right? The wish, the goal maybe, but the fixing isn't going to happen. So what can we do to make it better? What can we do to, in this case, I think for your example of the alt-right, which is just one of many examples, the education that's needed there so that they can other, they're refusing to other. They're refusing to see that there's discrimination happening in a lot of cases. That's where othering can be helpful. And I think that what we're trying to do here in some ways is bring that to light and say, this is where it's helpful. And this is where it can be something that moves this conversation forward for people who refuse to have the conversation because they're being race evasive, claiming color blindness. And that's where othering can shed light.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to read this out from Michelle, because it relates to the conversation. And then I'm going to bring in a question from MJ to finish us, but Michelle needs to leave on time, which is like 2 minutes. So I don't know whether you want, so I'm just going to read it for you because I've said it now, Michelle. Yeah, I have to jump off at 2:30, but loving this conversation, provocation. Just to be clear, I have mentioned no enemy and have attributed not to individuals, but to systems and collective formations. And I worry more about wealthy right wing / dark money, which is the big silence when we're speaking about the right and how, and we did talk, this came up and in and out yesterday in different sorts of ways, how white wealth feeds these ideological material dynamics behind the scenes. And I think this is it. These aren't equivalencies in any sort of way, really, that we're talking about. But thanks, Michelle, for that. Can I just try and bring in this question from MJ, recognizing that Michelle, God, I've now lost it. Right, where is MJ? We also, because it kind of relates to this conversation, but in a different sort of way, we also desire, covet, and envy the racialized, feminized, sexualized other. This makes the loathing all the more insidious. Or it was a comment anyway from MJ. Michelle, because you're going to go, would you like to just do a bit of a reflection on that, and then I'll bring everyone else in, and then we will draw it to a final kind of close.
No, I love that comment was made, MJ, because even in this Citadel scene, you could see the way in which that abuse was fetishized, sexualized, the ways in which sexual fantasies get associated with domination, cross-race, cross-gender, and the deep homophobic assaults and longings that often go together. We've done a lot of work with young people who are trans, who get trans young people of color who get assaulted by police sexually. And then when the police realize it's really a boy, they beat him up. And so the kind of sexual violence that gets entwined in these cross-power dynamics really need to be articulated. And I think, Phillip, you mentioned that we need more psychoanalysis here, and I think that's right. But I also don't want like the right wing painted as white working class people. I think when we look at where the money came from in Canada, when we look at in this country where the anti-CRT movement is coming from, this is white, wealthy, dark money.
Yeah.
Goodbye all, be safe. Hello, Colleen, to your baby. Bill, I love you. Goodbye, everybody. Sorry, gotta go.
No, thanks, Michelle.
Thanks a lot, Michelle.
Brilliant. So I think I will, if everybody would just like to make a final kind of comment, as long as you have time. Bernard, have you gone for your wine? I don't know. maybe? No?
I can see the bottle. I can see the bottle.
Okay, have you good? Just if everybody's got time, because we're dot on now, but I would like to give you all the opportunity. Just, okay, Bernard's gone again. I'm not sure what's going on. Let's just go with whoever's going to jump in. Bill?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how to say this, this idea of othering. In Germany, they do not have statues of Hitler. They do not teach Hitler as somehow a patriot in the past. And I have trouble with the alt-right and conservatives in general, when they don't see that to actually glorify people who were treasonous, it just blows my mind. I've had to, as a Black man, get through the 4,000 lynchings that occurred. In some instances, they actually burning of people alive and then chopping off their fingers and putting them on display. And yet I have learned to find a way to love white people, not in general, but as individuals. And that is the challenge to me, to the alt-right. How can they own what they are connected to, and how can they then turn around and love? And I don't see that. And I just, that may be off base, but that would be my counter to some of the things that Phillip was describing. This has been a fantastic privilege. What a wonderful product that you have produced. And can you imagine all the kinds of discussions that are going to occur for people as they read the book? But thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Bill.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Yeah,
thanks for being here.
Thank you. So I don't know who wants to jump in then for their final word. Am I just going to, Samantha, is that you?
Yes.
Okay.
This last discussion has been, for me, a playing out of all the tensions that I was thinking about on a personal level. How do I think of myself as a woman and as a white woman and as an academic in an economically stable position? How do I think of myself who can love other people as individuals while recognizing my and their group identities? So conversation has settled nothing, but has shown me that what live questions they are and how difficult it is to move between group, structural, political, and personal dimensions of the problems. So it's been really helpful to me. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions, and I've learned a tremendous amount. And thanks to Shona and Christi again.
Thanks, Samantha. It's great. So Bernard, you put your light on, so I'm just going to go to you before you go for your wine.
Yes. Thanks so much, Shona. Thanks so much to you and Christi for organizing this, and to all the colleagues who participated in this. I think for some of us, this is not an artificial intellectual question. It's a real question. I brought a couple of my students here tonight, and I wanted them to be part of this as young Black South Africans. To be Black and South African means something real. And that's what I tell them, because if you're Black, you present yourself as Black in the world. Nobody cares whether you have a PhD in philosophy or not. If the police are going to pull you down, actually they will do so. And you don't get automatic respect. I mean, I like anecdotal stories. I was in a pub once. It was a multiracial pub. And I said casually, of all my 10 years at university, the funny year was the 5th one. Then a white man laughed, like this sarcastic laugh. And he said to me, "Oh, then you must have a PhD, dude." So his assumption was that I was there for 10 years failing. And I said, "Of course I do have a PhD." And you should have seen his face. He was shocked, you know. It was like unbelievable to him. White folk are used to saying to me, "You speak such good English." And it's insulting, you know. But I also want to thank my colleague in South African philosophical circles, Samantha Vice. Her scholarship has been very brave, unusually brave. And yes, I just want to publicly on this forum thank you for your scholarship. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Christi. Thanks, Shona. Thanks, colleagues.
Oh,
Thank
wow,
you.
what a love fest now. We're back in the love fest. Michelle's missed the love. So come on, we've got 3 of you left, and then I'm going to give the last word to Christi, my co-editor, if that's okay. So
I don't have anything profound to say at all. So I just appreciate all of you and thank you for the thoughtful morning. For me, it's morning, and Bernard, it's making me a little jealous because it's barely afternoon now, and it's frowned upon to start drinking wine this early. But I'm thinking about it. It was really lovely to meet you all, though.
Wait your 10. In
the morning. Oh my goodness. Maybe okay, Philip, have you got a kind of final thoughts? And then I'm going to go Aman, then I'm going to go Christi.
Well, thank you again for putting all of this together, and thank you for this volume. Definitely appreciate it. Probably my only last thought would be that, especially for trying to move something like critical whiteness studies, critical studies of whiteness, however it would be phrased forward, it strikes me that what would be one of the more important things to do would be to try and much more strongly understand who is the other for us in terms of what they believe and what they think, and as difficult as it may be, to try and do so in both a non-judgmental and a non-condescending sort of way, that we're not looking at them as psychological subjects who are suffering from a disorder. And also on the very real possibility, I mean, kind of taking critique to its farthest level, on the possibility that they may show that there are problems with our own reasoning. That so maybe we have to be a little bit more expansive in what we think about the sort of nodes of oppression, and that perhaps some of the ones that we have kind of blurred over because of our own axioms and assumptions, we might find from them, along with seeing where they're horribly wrong.
Thanks, Philip. So Aman.
So my reflection from the conversation was really that actually I think that I think what's really difficult about talking to scholarship, right, is that you get to, when you're crafting a piece of work, you know, you get to put, well, that's what it is, it's crafting, right? And when you're in the moment, it's so hard to speak to the complicatedness. And I would disagree with Philip and say that actually, like, I think that, you know, the work that people have done shows that complicatedness is there in the analytic. What we're just not good at when we're talking is just like, I don't know, being able to bring all of that together and speak in the nuances that we mean in a way, right? And I felt that that's a lot of what was going on, and I think that that's where we get stuck. I don't know, there's something about that just felt really important, and something that actually I appreciate about your presence here, Phil, because I was thinking, actually, if I was a white working class person, how would I feel about being here right now? And yeah, that did something. So I guess I'm taking that away.
Thank you. Christi, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody. I think just from the point of view, also one of the focus areas for us has been with this volume to also create a conversation across the global south and global north. And I think that, so from that point of view, it's also been a very useful few days to actually facilitate that kind of conversation and to try and decenter North America. It does seem as though it's quite difficult to decenter North America, I should add. Much conversation, but we'll keep on trying and perhaps try and center Africa more. I think we'll keep up the valiant fight in that regard. So I do want to thank my my contributors, or our contributors, to also particularly to the Provocations section. It wasn't, the idea was to go perhaps to places that's not so easy to go to. And I appreciate Aman's also comments in this regard, and just Samantha and Philip's contributions, Colleen, of course, Cheryl, and Bernard, as always, one of my absolutely favorite thinkers here on the African continent. So yeah, so thank you so much. Thanks to Shona. And I think from here there will probably be, and in fact there will definitely be further events around the handbook, and we will share them with the authors. And maybe I should just do my usual thing, which is just to share with you where the book is purchasable, which I should have done earlier when we had more people in the room, but here it is. Oh no, that's the wrong one, sorry. Basically, in terms of our international audience, it is Routledge.com is the obvious place to go to. And I'm just having difficulty for some reason to get this on.
Yeah, I think it was there, Christi. No? Yeah, yeah. No, we can see it. Yeah, I can.
The one that gives the details about the. No, this is not. Sorry, people. Let me just close this. Okay. Let me just. It's a long song and dance to actually do something that's not so complicated. But basically, here it is. So Routledge.com, if you're outside of South Africa. Inside South Africa, we have actually made a special deal with loot.co.za and it is now much more affordable. It's less than a quarter of the international price. Unfortunately, if you're outside of the country, you won't be able to enjoy this price. But it's for South Africans, the handbook is absolutely unaffordable. It's like it's an equivalent to literally 10 books. In the South African market. So go to loot.co.za. This is for our South African participants today, and you'll find a much more affordable price there. And yeah, so I think that suffices from my side. Just to say, it's also late at night here in South Africa, 9:45 at night. Philip, I think it's even a bit later where you are. So I do appreciate. People sticking around. Oman, you're also just a couple of hours behind us. So thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye. Oh,